Chapter 245. After leveling up his shadow dancer profession, Soren still had more than 60,000 slaughter EXP left. In one breath, he put all the slaughter EXP into the wizard profession level, preparing to get one more attribute point. This was the last attribute point he could get in advance. Starting from wizard profession level 9, the slaughter EXP needed to increase their strength began to multiply. After wizard profession level 15, the slaughter EXP needed to level up was completely higher than any other profession. In the future, unless Soren could successfully kill a god, the speed of accumulating slaughter EXP would be far from enough. The wizard profession has leveled up to level 8. Receive 25, INT 20 plus, INT 20 to 10, asterisk 0, 5, skill points, HP increased by 10, profession HP 4 plus, con 21 to 10, asterisk 0, 5. Received 1 free attribute point. The wizard profession has leveled up to level 9. Received 25, INT 20 plus, INT 20 to 10, asterisk 0, 5, skill points, HP increased by 10, profession HP 4 plus, con 21 to 10, asterisk 0, 5. Received 1 ability point. 1 attribute point at each level, and 1 ability point at each level. Without a doubt, Soren put the free attribute point into dexterity, pushing his dexterity to 24 points, and then put the ability he got into, enhanced dual wielding. Although Soren wanted to use this ability point to master the wizard's metamagic ability, he thought about it and decided to put it into combat ability. The wizard's combat power was very strong, but it was a profession that consumed a lot of time, money, and energy. Soren didn't have enough time to learn spells, conduct research, and hone his casting skills. So, his first combat priority was still in the rogue field, which he was most familiar with. The wizard's spells were only auxiliary to his combat ability. Greater dual wielding, personal ability, with more and more combat experience, you have become more and more proficient in dual wielding. You are already a master of dual wielding. Even in the Underdark, there are not many people who are more powerful than you. Among 1,000 people who use dual weapons in battle, you can be ranked first. You have already grasped and comprehended the advanced technique of using dual weapons in battle. This allows you to use dual weapons in battle without any mistakes or penalties. Number of attacks per round plus 3, no hit penalty, 18 dexterity. I finally got advanced dual wielding. Soren looked around and walked to the edge of the ship. He held the 2 scimitars in his hands and lifted up a wooden plank. Clang! Rays of cold light flashed. Soren unsheathed his scimitars at the same time, and the wooden board was shrouded in the glint of his scimitars. By the time Soren finished a round of attacks and sheathed his scimitars, the wooden board had already turned into 12 pieces of wood that fell to the ground. He had slashed out a total of 8 times. His right hand had slashed out 5 times, and his left hand had slashed out 3 times. Since Soren hadn't mastered the legendary dual wielding ability, he couldn't perfectly replicate the speed of his 2 hands. That was the limit of what he could do. Soren's current talent accumulation was not enough. At his peak, he could slash out 18 times in 1 round. Remark: 1 round refers to the speed of 1 second. In actual combat, one might not be able to maintain this speed. If you're interested, you can try it with a small knife. Ordinary people can also slash out 2 to 3 times in a second, but it's very difficult to go beyond that. After distributing the free attribute points and talent points, Soren focused his attention on the skill points. He had been holding back for so long, and finally, he had reached the requirements to master the background ability, Sage. God had opened his eyes. After enduring for so long, he had finally made it. In order to achieve the conditions of mastering Erudite, he didn't even invest much skill points into his rogue class skills. He relied entirely on his own battle experience to improve bit by bit, and the speed of improvement was really quite slow. Soren's current rogue's skills had not even reached 50 points. If it wasn't for the background ability, Sage, he would have already increased all his skills to more than 100 points. With the allocation of skill points, Soren's knowledge finally reached 250 points. A row of data also appeared, special conditions triggered. Prerequisite ability, encyclopedic knowledge, achieved. The prerequisite of 250 literacy has been achieved. You have automatically received a new background ability, Sage. As soon as the data appeared, Soren couldn't wait to look at his new background ability. Sage, background ability, your knowledge has become more and more amazing. You know almost every field. As you accumulate more knowledge, you will be able to comprehend most things by analogy, and your learning speed will be several times faster than others. This is not only limited to knowledge, but also a variety of combat skills. You know how to calculate the weight axis of a weapon, how to calculate the time gap between casting spells, and use this to maximize its power. But you know more than this. The accumulation of knowledge has reached your current level, and it can be directly transformed into real power. Knowledge plus 10, prerequisite, have the ability, encyclopedic knowledge, 250 knowledge. Prerequisite for the special ability, Master of Knowledge. Prerequisite for the special ability, Astral Traveler. Prerequisite for the special ability, Dimension Explorer. This is because he didn't have a spellcaster profession in the past, Soren's knowledge wasn't very high, and he didn't have the talent ability, encyclopedic knowledge. So when he saw the row of prerequisites, Soren couldn't help but be surprised. Among them, Master of Knowledge, was needless to say. This was an advanced ability of Sage. But the last two hints seemed to be a bit amazing. Just by looking at the names, one could tell that it was very powerful. Especially, Astral Traveler, this was a famous background ability. Many legendary wizards even had the background ability, Astral Traveler, which was a legendary level background ability. As for the other, Dimension Explorer, Soren didn't know much about it. After allocating knowledge, Soren still had 12 skill points left, so he simply added them to Sneak. Anyway, a rogue's Sneak skill would never be too high. At this time, Soren's overall attributes were very different from the past. He had finally entered the level of powerful people. Name, Soren race, half-elf, son of slaughter, attributes, strength 14, +2, agility 24, +1, constitution 21, intelligence 20, +1, wisdom 15, charm 18, +2, alignment, lawful evil profession, level 10 commoner, level 7 rogue, 063500, level 3 shadow dancer, 075500, level 9 wizard, 068500, grade 3, health points, 254254 experience points, 3075, slaughter exp, 545, profession exp, unassigned, skill points, none attribute points, none legend level, 21 divinity points, 9 status, normal basic skills. Sneak 185, knowledge 250, steal 45, pick lock 55, snare 60, focus 30, negotiate 45, appraise 30, deceive 18, threaten 42, taunt 15, perform 15, listen 20, dodge 85, parry 25, block 18, heal 45, search 20, detect 25, copy scroll 25, spell identification 20, survival 15, use magic device 20, cooking 30, alchemy 15. Legendary skills, omnipotent hands. Special abilities, blessing of the misfortune goddess, blessing of the sea goddess, killing heart, slayer, ascetic, scholar. Personal abilities, nimble left hand, eidetic memory, perseverance, encyclopedic knowledge, reflex evasion, nimble movement, evade sight, dark vision, spell control, empower spell, weak cold resistance, greater dual wielding, regeneration, intermediate. Profession abilities, shadow weave, military weapon, proficiency, curved sword, master. Combat skills, summon shadow, fearful gaze, divine, fear, divine, shadow strike, shadow jump, counterspell, sword form, heavy hack, sword form, behead. There were 3 main parts of combat power. The first was attribute points. One's attributes were the most direct combat power. People with high strength had high destructive power, people with high dexterity had high agility, people with high constitution had good endurance, and so on. The second was basic skills. This was a comprehensive ability in all kinds of situations, and it was also the area that determined one's most obvious weakness. Most of the time, basic skills couldn't be too low. If you didn't have enough parrying and blocking, you couldn't fight a tough battle. If your dodging ability was too poor, you would be finished if you encountered arrows. If you couldn't detect, listen, or survive in the wild, you would be a tragic figure. Even a kobold could successfully sneak up on you. As for your searching ability, if you were too poor, you wouldn't even be able to find the loot. Then there were other basic skills such as acting, deception, and intimidation, which were very useful. When you were adventuring, you would also need to know how to negotiate, appraise, and heal. Therefore, basic skills that didn't seem to be very eye-catching were often things that could determine your fate. Finally, there was the ability. This was very time-consuming and difficult to train, but it was also the most powerful part of combat power. Theoretically speaking, most of the people who could kill other high-grade professions basically had a clear advantage in their ability. These three parts of strength, when combined, would be your overall combat power. In the process of fighting against the enemy, as long as you could form an advantage in one of these aspects, your chances of winning would be increased by a lot. Soren liked to estimate his chances of winning every time he took action. Most of the time, his chances of winning were calculated according to these three conditions. If there was no obvious chance of winning, he would give up in the end. Time passed little by little. Sailing on the sea was actually a waste of time, and most of the time, it was very boring. Soren used up most of his slaughter EXP in one breath, and then began to train his combat ability. Earning slaughter EXP was only a part of improving one's strength. Sharpening one's combat skills and mastering one's ability was also quite important. Adele Isabella was still Soren's training partner, but this time, Soren increased the difficulty. He directly covered his eyes with a black cloth. The blind battle ability was a very important special ability. It was very useful in many situations, so Soren had to master it in advance. Clang! 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 The two quickly began to test each other's strength. Because Soren was blindfolded, most of the time he was on the defense. In the process of fighting against Adele Isabella, he was obviously at a disadvantage, but he didn't look like he was going to lose. On the contrary, as the number of battles increased, he gradually became invincible. He didn't know if it was an illusion, but after he mastered the Sage ability, his whole mind seemed to have become clearer. He could actually summarize Adele Isabella's attack style, habitual attack skills, subconscious attack direction, and so on in the process of battle. He could even summarize the memory of the wind detection skill, including what sound represented what action. This wasn't an improvement in intelligence. In Soren's view, it should be that his calculation and summarization ability had been further strengthened. It was as if the accumulation of knowledge had reached a critical point, and suddenly began to understand by analogy. In his mind, he could even speculate the direction of Adele's next attack. It felt a bit like danger sense. Clang! Clang! A series of battle sounds rang out, and Soren gradually began to get used to it. Sometimes, he could even counterattack the red-haired female pirate with the blind battle skills. In front of him, Adele obviously felt that the battle was getting more and more difficult. She gasped for breath, raised her hand to lift up her fiery red hair, and looked at Soren with eyes full of awe and disbelief. Her expression was as if she was looking at a monster. It wasn't that she had never seen a guy with amazing talent and a strong learning ability, but she had never heard of a person who could learn and grasp the ability to reach Soren's level. In the beginning, in order to master the blind battle skill, she spent nearly a year or two training. But how long did Soren take? Less than 3 days. According to this progress, in at most half a month, he would be able to master the blind battle skill. Received 3 information prompts. An afternoon of training quickly passed by. After today's training, Soren received a prompt for the second ordinary ability, battle experience. With each battle at sea, your combat ability in the sea environment has improved, and your ability to balance against the ship's bumps has increased. You have received some information about battle at sea. Perhaps it was because he hadn't accumulated enough. Soren only received a prompt for battle at sea, and the other abilities required further training. 2 days passed quickly. As the fleet gradually sailed towards the outer islands, they encountered more and more creatures along the way. They saw schools of swordfish, probably more than 100,000 of them. There was also a large group of flying scale fish that reflected the sparkling waves of the sea, as well as a large number of other fish. Because there were many dangerous sea creatures in the deep sea, fishermen rarely went into the sea to catch fish. There were tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, or even millions of fish moving around. Yesterday afternoon, Soren saw that the sea had turned red. He thought that he had encountered some kind of monster, and was shocked for a moment. Then he found out that it was an uncountable number of lobsters. These lobsters were about the size of 3 fingers, which was a relatively common size in the current sea area. It was hard to tell how many lobsters there were, but there were sailors who threw a net into the sea and caught hundreds of red-shelled lobsters. The taste didn't seem to be anything special, and it wasn't much different from the lobsters he ate in his previous life. However, their pincers were more powerful, and their strength was greater than the lobsters in his previous life. If they encountered a larger lobster, they could directly snap a person's finger. An unlucky sailor almost had his finger snapped by a large lobster. In the evening, Soren sat on the deck and cut the lobsters with his dagger. Most of these lobsters were about the size of 2 fingers, and some of them were especially large, reaching the size of a person's palm. The pirates below caught more than 10 lobsters, and hurriedly sent someone to bring them to Soren to please him. Then Soren turned around and made roasted lobsters. At this moment, he was feeding Vivian, whose mouth was full of oil. The little girl was eating very happily today. Because this was made by her brother, and because her brother's cooking was really delicious. Soren was rich. Naturally, he could use those expensive seasonings. When cooking, there were only 3 key points: ingredients, seasonings, and cooking skills. Soren now had good ingredients, expensive seasonings, and good cooking skills. Naturally, the food he made wouldn't taste bad. The little girl ate 2 lobsters in a row, and then she rubbed her round little belly with satisfaction. But at this time, the lookout on the ship next to them let out a suppressed cry of alarm and shouted, "Sea monster! There's a sea monster!" A commotion broke out. Then, a huge shadow appeared in the distance. The shadow was hiding under the sea, and it looked like a giant squid. It seemed to be more than 50 meters long. It really was a sea monster. Cries of alarm came from all directions, and then many people nervously looked at Soren's position. "Calm down." Soren stood at the bow of the ship and said in a deep voice, "Let's go over like this, don't make any moves." The distance between them was getting closer and closer. The sea monster was really a giant squid. It was about 60 meters long, and its huge body was a little scary. It obviously noticed the fleet in front of it, and it even circled around Soren. Then, as if it felt something, it avoided the fleet in front of it and swam past them about 100 meters away. There was no accident, so there was no battle. The 2 sides just brushed past each other. Soren watched the sea monster leave, but he thought to himself, "It seems that the blessing of the sea goddess is very effective." This was the first sea monster they encountered. In the next 2 days, they encountered another 2 sea monsters, but they didn't attack them. On the 5th day of the voyage, they were finally close to their destination, and Soren began to see scattered islands. They were almost at the outer islands. The 5th day of quitting smoking. Maybe it's because I'm always feeling uncomfortable, but it should be over in 2 days. I forgot who said it would be a lot better after 7 days. A 5,000-word chapter. Chapter 246. The Outer Islands. The geographical environment of this area was a bit special because it originally belonged to a continent. Later on, a large area of the continental plate collapsed and sank, causing the geography of the area to become like this. From the map, it was a bit like the place near Singapore after the Spratly Islands, but there were more scattered islands than the continental plate. The largest one was the territory of the Amazons, followed by the base camp of the indigenous people, and many large and small islands scattered in the sea. As he entered the area of the outer islands, Soren's face became dignified. The environment of this area was a bit like a tropical rainforest area, full of unknown dangers. Although the islands didn't attract much attention, the challenge difficulty of these islands were all level 9 and above. In other words, even a group of adventurers around grade 3 could be wiped out on some of these islands. There were a lot of unknown and terrifying creatures here, some of them were even small, but they were more dangerous than the dragon subspecies. Moreover, there were also prehistoric pythons that were quite difficult to deal with. Some of them had a challenge rating of 15 and above. Basically, they were almost the same as dragons. Soren didn't have the slightest intention to explore these islands. Some of these places even the indigenous people wouldn't easily go near, so he naturally didn't want to explore these dangerous places. His destination was a large island in front of him. If he remembered correctly, there was an island with a diameter of more than 500 square kilometers in front of him, and there were other islands next to it. This was Soren's first stop. If it was suitable, he would set up a camp here. This was because the places he chose had natural harbors. Another 2 days passed. When Soren saw a towering mountain in front of him and a cliff standing on the coastline, he finally knew that he had arrived at his destination. There were many seagulls in front of him, and he could see a dense forest in the distance. There was a thick layer of bird droppings on the ground. The nearby islands were the resting places of migratory birds, so there was a huge amount of bird droppings accumulated here for thousands of years. Don't underestimate these bird droppings, they were a very precious resource. Because in simpler terms, these bird droppings accumulated over time and covered the ground, and they could be refined into the best fertilizer. Soren chose this place as a base not only because of the geographical advantage. Stop here. Soren looked at the others, then shifted his gaze to a spot on the cliff. There was a metal cross there, and there seemed to be white bones on it. This white bones was once a very famous pirate king. Later, he fell into the hands of the enemy and was directly nailed to death by cruel torture. His ghost appeared there, but it could only be encountered at a specific time. He would make a very difficult request to the others, and if it was completed, he would be able to obtain his treasure. The pirate king's soul seemed to have special requirements to meet his soul in the spiritual realm. Soren wasn't interested in accepting such a quest, even though the difficulty of this quest was almost legendary tier. He looked at the others and said, "You guys stay here. Adele Isabella. Humpback Whale, Hulk. The few of you, follow me to the island to take a look." A small fast boat was released. Soren quickly brought a few people to the island. Perhaps it was because there were very few outsiders here. When they just set foot on the island, birds actually flew all over the sky. There seemed to be some noise in the distance, but it soon calmed down. The town could be built in this area, but it was only relatively safe. Soren naturally wouldn't be naive enough to think that there were no enemies here. He didn't go too deep into the jungle, but came to a flat land south of the cliff. This was a natural flat land, and it was also the place where others founded and built a town. There were some white stones in the woods, and they were very brittle to the touch. They broke when you pinched them. Soren picked up a piece and smelled it, and then there was a smile on his face. The others also picked it up curiously and smelled it, but immediately threw it away with a face full of disgust because it smelled like feces and urine. These pirates couldn't see the value of these stones, but for Soren, they were the most important wealth, even more valuable than a gold mine. This place was actually an inexhaustible gold mine. It was just that the Aborigines did not know how to make use of it. Guano stone, a kind of ore, also known as bird and beast feces. The accumulated feces and corpses of birds, bats, and seals are a kind of high-quality fertilizer. Soren's mind was filled with the knowledge that he had learned before. The location of this island near the forest was the accumulation point of guano stones. Because it was in an area where migratory birds migrated, it was unknown how many guano stones had accumulated over thousands of years. 3 feet deep into the ground was the raw material of high-quality fertilizer. However, these were not the only valuable things here. Soren carefully looked around, then put his hands on the hilt of his sword, and gestured to the few people behind him, and said in a deep voice, "Pay attention. There may be monsters around here." He gradually moved forward along the flat land, and as his eyes got higher and higher, the terrain began to become a high slope. Then there was a red land in front of him. There were some active beasts nearby, but when they saw Soren, they immediately fled. These beasts felt the dangerous aura from them, and even a cheetah was scared and ran into the forest. Soren used his curved sword to cut the soil, then reached out and pinched the red soil in his hand, and then threw it on the ground with a smile on his face. It was indeed clay. In his memory, the town that was built here was built with red bricks. He didn't know what kind of craftsmanship was used, but in just 3 months, a brick house was built, and a large wall was cut out. Bricks had begun to appear in ancient Rome, and when humans fired pottery, they had tried to fire other things with clay. Soren knew a little about the craft of making porcelain, so the requirements of firing red bricks were too simple for him. However, the most important point was how to increase the production. The construction technology in this world was quite advanced, but mass production was not widespread. Most of the high-end products were made by spellcasters. Soren still didn't know how that group of people burned so many bricks in a short time. But it didn't matter. That group of people began to develop overseas after the Avatar crisis, and he was now 2 years ahead of them. Even if he lacked a little technical advantage, he could still develop on a larger scale first. "What are you doing, sir?" A guy with a big head, who looked like a big-headed doll but had a ferocious face, stood at the back and whispered, "He's looking at the rocks and the soil." "Are you looking to see if this place is suitable for farming? The land overseas is wasteland, and even if you want to reclaim it, it will take several years to become mature. Don't look at me like that. Before I became a pirate, I also plowed the land for several years." The appearance of a pirate was strange, and it basically had nothing to do with their appearance. He noticed that the others were looking at him strangely, and couldn't help but laugh. "Don't look at me when I cut off heads. In fact, I'm also quite good at farming." Soren didn't pay attention to the back. He walked all the way to the top of the high slope, then looked down at the flat land in the distance, and then calculated the size and distance of the space in his mind. Maybe it was because of his powerful calculation ability, or maybe it was because of the data simulation, he actually built a rough town model in his mind. This place could accommodate the development space of a medium-sized city. Don't underestimate the guilds that developed overseas in his previous life. Many of them were professional talents, and the place they chose naturally had many comprehensive advantages. On the other side, the half-elf first mate stood on the bow of the ship. Suddenly, he seemed to feel something. He couldn't help but look down at the bottom of the sea. The person next to him asked in confusion, "What's wrong?" He stared at the bottom of the sea for a while, then shook his head gently and said, "Nothing. I just saw something just now." Time ticked by. About 2 hours later, Soren finally finished inspecting the nearby area, and then came back with the others. He had made a decision in his heart. Although he still had 2 spare places that he hadn't seen, Soren was already very satisfied with this place. The location of the other 2 places was a bit remote, and it was still a day or 2 away from here. If he wanted to develop overseas, he must rely on the resources of the mainland. Therefore, the closer the route, the better. It would also be easier to transport other materials. This location, whether it was a natural port, geographical advantages, land resources, etc., could be regarded as a first-class place in the outer islands. And there was another advantage here, that was, the location was relatively far away from the Amazon's range of activity, and it was not near the indigenous people's base camp. Because the island was not very large, there were not many indigenous people who migrated here. In the outer islands, generally, the larger the island, the fiercer the competition was because it was a large territory. On the contrary, small islands had insufficient space for development, and sometimes there were no indigenous people living there. The island in front of him was neither big nor small. It was just right. There was room for development, and it was not too eye-catching. Disembark. Soren's face finally showed a smile, and he said in a deep voice, "Ship all the materials down and arrange for people to camp on the flat land in front." He was ready to enclose the land here. It's not easy to quit smoking. On the 6th day, my mental state has been very difficult recently, and this plot is being written slowly, so there may be fewer updates. Developing overseas is not a casual encirclement. It's a suicidal act. There are actually a lot of foreshadowing in this plot, and many things must be explained clearly. Finally, in 2 days, I will announce a big event full of positive energy to you. Moi. Wait until I get through this period, then I will explode. Chapter 247. Speaking of Fu Tu's success in quitting smoking, is this considered as spreading positive energy? The 8th day, it's really not easy. Today, there are 2 more. The recent plot will be more high energy. Teams of people began to get busy. Soren stood on the deck of the Dragon Head warship and looked at the others. The Chamber of Commerce's management drove out the slaves and then let them carry things off the ship. The slave trade was not that simple. It was not that you could sell people as slaves as long as you caught them. The capture of slaves was limited to the indigenous people. If you dared to capture slaves on the mainland, it could be said that there would be people who would cut you with a knife. Even the relatively evil lords and aristocrats would never allow slave traders to act recklessly. They would be hanged at the intersection. Among Soren's slaves, about half of them were indigenous people, followed by about half of the mainland population. Slaves would appear because of many things, such as war, crime, bankruptcy, and so on. Selling oneself as a slave was also very common in this world. After bankruptcy, it was not surprising that they would become debt goods. Among them, the slaves of the mainland population were a little better. The indigenous slaves were much more troublesome. They had to be captured and then tamed. The price of a docile slave could be increased by more than 50%, while a disobedient slave was only suitable to be thrown into the arena. There were many ways to tame slaves, some even involved taboo areas. Most of the slaves on the market were tamed slaves. The price of mainland slaves was higher, and the price of indigenous slaves was relatively cheaper. Soren did not have enough financial resources to use all the slaves from the mainland, so the proportion of indigenous slaves was still very high. With Soren's current experience, he could naturally see that many indigenous slaves' eyes lit up after getting off the ship because this was the outer islands they were familiar with. This made Soren feel a little headache, but there was no way. After all, this was where they lived. Returning to the place they were familiar with, these indigenous slaves' minds would easily have other thoughts. Watch them. Soren turned and glanced at Adele, Isabella next to him. The red-haired female pirate seemed to be thinking about something. She stood on the deck in a daze for a while, then she came back to her senses. Soren said to her, "Pay attention to these indigenous slaves, you must not let them have a chance to escape." Adele, Isabella quickly nodded and said in a deep voice, "Yes. Your Excellency." At the other side, there were already pirate leaders preparing to set up camp. These pirates were not a group of incompetent people who only knew how to fight. It was actually much harder to make a living on the sea than on land. Although many pirates were illiterate, they still had some knowledge. For example, the guy who was missing 2 fingers and had a scar on his forehead. This guy couldn't even write his own name, but he actually knew astrology and could sail in the sea without getting lost. Even if he didn't have any celestial bodies, he could still make a rough judgment based on the ocean currents, temperature, wind direction, and so on. This guy was a very capable person. Even though he wasn't that strong, he was still promoted to be the new pirate leader by Soren. Pirates respected capable people. The most important ability was combat power, but they also respected other abilities. Otherwise, a navigator's status would not be higher than that of many pirates. A large group of subordinates were preparing to set up camp. Soren had already brought a lot of supplies, enough for them to use for more than 3 months. There were also various tools. For this, he had mobilized a lot of resources from the Chamber of Commerce in Port Tylon. The others could more or less guess Soren's idea, but they were not so optimistic. The main reason was that there were too many dangers in the outer islands, and the land was not so suitable for farming. There were also all kinds of strange creatures and very xenophobic indigenous people. If there were indigenous people nearby and knew that they were camping here, the possibility of them attacking was quite high. Time passed little by little. Soren watched with satisfaction as the camp was set up. The pirates were cutting down trees, and a simple camp was now 1/3 complete. In front, the half-elf first mate was instructing others to set up the tents. On the other side, the one-eyed man and the bald man were shouting at the slaves to carry the supplies. It looked like it would rain today, so it was best to move all the things into the tents. The weather change was also a very troublesome thing. It was impossible for the sun to always shine. Storms were more common here, and many supplies would be ruined once they got wet. The tools had been moved out, and the others were ready to erect a simple fence with wood according to Soren's instructions. Originally, Soren thought that his first day in the outer islands would pass peacefully. But he was wrong. Ah! A shrill scream suddenly came from a distance, and then Soren's figure turned into a shadow and rushed over. With Soren's action, the other pirate leaders hurriedly pulled out their weapons and rushed over. At the same time, they also ordered their men to prepare for battle. After all, this was the outer islands, the territory of the indigenous people. It was normal to have a battle. However, as Soren rushed over, he immediately found that it was not an attack by the indigenous people, but another kind of trouble that was also very troublesome. Your Excellency. The pirates standing in front of Soren's teeth were chattering. He was holding a leg in his hand, but only half of it was bloody. He stammered, "Frog." Frog was eaten. Only this much is left. Frog? It seemed to be the nickname of a pirate. There were often some messy nicknames among pirates. Soren frowned and glanced at the leg in his hand that originally belonged to a pirate nicknamed Frog. He noticed some irregular teeth marks on it and said with a serious expression, "What happened? What did you just see?" I saw it. I saw it." This guy was probably frightened, and he spoke a little incoherently. After a while, he gradually calmed down and said, "I went to cut trees with Frog, and looked for dry firewood on the way, but we didn't expect. Just when we were passing by, a strange plant suddenly opened a bloody mouth. Then Frog was swallowed. I wanted to pull him out. But that's all I could pull out." The pirate in front of him, who was frightened to the point of confusion, raised the bloody half of the thigh in his hand. Then, he abruptly woke up and threw it away, as if his mind was still a little confused. At this time, the other pirates also rushed over. Soren turned to look at them and said, "It's not the indigenous people. Let the others go back and be on guard. Adele, you come with me to take a look. It would be easier if it wasn't the indigenous people." Because at this time, encountering the indigenous people was very likely to lead to a big battle. Soren didn't want to lose his men in a battle now. "Your Excellency." Adele looked at the half of the leg on the ground with an ugly expression and wondered, what kind of monster did this? It can swallow a person in one bite, and only half a leg is left. It doesn't seem to be an easy monster to deal with. Soren looked at her and said slowly, "I don't know. But I can roughly guess what it is. It seems that we are in trouble. There is a mutated area near this island. The plants inside have mutated. The jungle in front of them had traces of logging. In order to build a camp, they naturally needed to cut wood. Although Soren had the idea of burning bricks, the current resources and manpower were not enough. Cutting wood was the fastest way to build a camp. Adele Isabella followed behind. She looked at Soren and whispered, "Your Excellency. I suggest that we set fire to the mountain once. Otherwise, there will be too many poisonous insects and snakes here. Today, 2 or 3 people have been bitten by poisonous insects and snakes. Although it was not fatal, there was still a guy whose wound worsened. If this goes on, we will consume a lot of manpower to deal with poisonous insects. Yes. Poisonous insects and snakes were a very troublesome problem. Those who had never been to such a primitive area would not be able to imagine how many poisonous insects there were. If someone had smoked a house that had not been lived in for a long time, or some holes in the wild, they would find all kinds of insects crawling out of them. Just looking at them would make one's scalp tingle. It was not so easy to open up the wilderness, let alone open up the more dangerous outer islands. They were getting closer and closer to the site of the incident. Soren suddenly reached out and stopped the red-haired female pirate next to him, and then said in a deep voice, "Be careful. There's something wrong with this jungle." It was too quiet. The jungle in front of them was too quiet. It was so quiet that even the sound of insects could not be heard. Adele Isabella stretched out her hands and held the two swords. Then she bent slightly and looked around. She also found that the environment in front of her was very wrong. It seemed that the nearby plants and trees looked a little strange. Their colors were too bright, and they grew too well. The other trees nearby have withered leaves and branches, but the forest in front of us is lush and green. There were drops of blood in front of them. Soren reached out and picked up a little blood to take a look. Then he saw a strange plant that looked like a morning glory. The blood started from there and came all the way here. His face was not very good, and he murmured, "Rip flower? Damn it. This is really a mutated area." Rip flower, mutated plant, piranha flower, grade 4. Challenge rating, level 8, monster level 16, has spell-like abilities. Highest and lowest attributes, 22 and 10. Total attribute points, 90 to 100. Special abilities, devouring attack, vine tentacles, mutated plant, piranha flower. Difficulty, C+. Chapter 248. Rip flower. One of the variants of the man-eating flower, a dangerous creature that looked like a giant trumpet flower. There were many strange plants in the jungle, including the man-eating plants. Most of them were man-eating flowers and man-eating trees. Ordinary man-eating plants were easier to deal with, but the most difficult ones were the mutants. Because of a catastrophe in the outer islands, there was an invisible energy field underground, so the creatures here were prone to mutation. Although humans did not have many mutations, they also had some strange innate abilities, mastering spell-like skills similar to psionic. However, it was not real, psionic, but a manifestation of a single psionic spell. This kind of energy field would not only affect the indigenous people, but also these mutated plants. Therefore, some abnormal creatures would also have spell-like abilities. For example, the rip flower in front of them. It may have some special spell-like abilities, but it was hard to say what they were because many mutant creatures were different. "Your Excellency." Adele Isabella frowned and looked ahead, whispering, "How do we deal with it?" She didn't know if it was a woman's intuition, but she thought that the strange plant in front of her was not so easy to deal with, because this strange plant gave her a very dangerous aura, which made her say, "Your Excellency. How about we use kerosene to deal with it? I remember there are several barrels of kerosene on the ship, which should be able to burn this creature." Soren turned to look at her, shook his head and said, "It's useless. Fire is too ineffective against this creature. It needs a lot of kerosene to burn it. More than half of its body roots are in the ground. Cover me." Soren bowed slightly and whispered, then flew towards the location of the rip flower. This kind of mutant creature's reaction was relatively slow, and it had relatively stronger vitality than many flesh and blood creatures. Soren had to familiarize himself with its combat power first, because there were probably more of these creatures. The challenge of the outer islands was no less difficult than that of the Underdark, and nearly 1/3 of it was because of such dangerous creatures. They were not weaker than the various monsters and creatures in the Underdark, and some were even more dangerous. Fire was not realistic. Unless they got something like asphalt gasoline, they could burn the rip flower in front of them. Otherwise, using other firewood was simply sending their men to their deaths. A creature level of 16 was no joke. Although the challenge level of the rip flower was not high, only half of the creature level, and the final challenge difficulty was only level C, its creature level was on the same level as the sky dragon. The reason why the difficulty was so low was because it was a plant-type enemy and had a relatively obvious weakness. However, plant-type enemies also had one thing in common, and that was that the underground part was the most crucial part. Just attacking the surface alone might not be enough to kill them. Bang! Soren stomped his feet on a nearby tree to gain momentum. Then, he swung his machete at the rip flower in front of him. The surface of this man-eating flower was its feeding organ. Looking at the bulging inside, it was obvious that the dead pirate was inside. However, what Soren did not expect was that the rip flower did not react to his attack at all. When his machete hit the surface of the ground, it suddenly seemed to be startled, and 5 or 6 vines shot out from the ground in an instant. Soren's blade seemed to have hit a tough cowhide. It was clearly a plant, but after cutting the surface, a bright red liquid flowed out. It looked a bit like blood. Clang! Soren cut the vines with his machete, and blood flowed out from it. These vines were unspeakably strange. After being cut off and falling to the ground, they were like the tentacles of a strange animal, which made people feel a little numb. At this moment, the surface feeding organ of the petal, which was as tough as cowhide, opened up. In the outer part of the petal, 3 rows of densely packed teeth could be seen. The teeth were a bit like the teeth of a great white shark. They were all fine and sharp teeth, and then they were distributed in 3 layers inside and outside. These teeth were still stained with blood and minced meat. Inside the petal, one could see the extension of the plant's rhizomes. It was like pulling open a plant's tube to provide nutrients. The petal in front of him also had something like blood vessels. The 3 rows of tiny teeth were actually wiggling on their own. Inside the huge flower bud was a pile of flesh that had been completely disfigured. Soren smelled something like a strong acid. However, it was not a strong acid, but the acid secreted by the rip flower in front of him. This liquid could help it digest most of its prey, and then transfer part of the nutrients its body needed to the underground trunk. Although the rip flower could rely on the soil to grow, its staple food was still the flesh and blood of various living creatures. Soren slashed out 3 times in a row. However, the effect was not very high. The part of the rip flower that was directly above its body had a very strong defensive ability. When he slashed it, it was like slashing a dragon's skin. It did not cause much damage. A part of its trunk was attacked. Although the rip flower had no eyes or facial features, it still felt Soren's position. Then, the huge bud suddenly opened up, like a bloody mouth, and bit at Soren. Unfortunately, he was already prepared. How could he be bitten so easily? Instead, he took the opportunity to slash at the bottom of the root. The tough root was not cut off at once. Soren took the opportunity to slash several times in a row, and only then did he break the feeding organ above. Then, a very strange thing happened. There seemed to be a strange sound coming from the underground, and then he saw the flying vines retract a little. Then, the ground under Soren's feet seemed to have a small pit. The feeding organ that was cut off on the ground looked like a huge morning glory, but the part with 3 layers of sharp teeth began to wither rapidly after being disconnected, as if it suddenly lost enough nutrients. Then the other part below seemed to have drilled deeper into the ground. Soren stabbed the ground with his sword, but he did not feel anything else. Let's go back first. Soren frowned as if he was thinking about something. He looked at his data prompt and did not receive any slaughter EXP. It seemed that the rip flower was not dead yet. After he stepped back for a while, he said in a low voice, "Tell the others not to come here first. The plants here are very strange. There may be something terrible down there." Chapter 249. The most important part of a plant was definitely its roots. Many old trees could still sprout after their trunks were cut off, but if there was a problem with their roots, they would not live for long. The mutated plant creatures in the outer islands were all like this. Whether it was man-eating flowers, man-eating trees, or other unknown mutated plants, their core weakness was their roots. The things on the surface of the ground would not die even if they were cut off, and it would not take long for them to grow back. When a plant mutated to this extent, it was almost the same as an animal. Although they did not have as much intelligence as animals, they still relied on their instincts to do things. This area should be one of the places left behind by the disaster, but he did not know what was inside. With Soren's current strength, it was not a big problem for him to deal with these things, but this place was too strange, and he did not dare to take the risk to go deep into it. It was better to leave this place for later, as he had a lot of things to do now. However, just as Soren was about to seal off this place to temporarily prevent others from approaching, Adele Isabella seemed to have seen something. She raised her finger and pointed in that direction and said, "Your Excellency, look. There seems to be something there." "What is it?" Soren stopped when he heard this, then looked to the side and saw a grayish-black thing. He carefully walked over, paying attention to the strange trees nearby, then reached out and grabbed a corner to pick it up. However, he could not pull it out when he tried hard. It seemed that there was still a part of it buried under the ground. In desperation, he could only make a gesture to the red-haired female pirate behind him, and then the two of them used their weapons to dig out the grayish-black stone at the same time. "It's obsidian." Soren's face showed an expression of disbelief, then he looked at the grayish-black stone in his hand. Because of the long-term weathering and the passage of time, this obsidian no longer looked like it used to, but he could vaguely tell that it was part of a building sculpture, and it should have existed for a long time. Obsidian was a very strong and durable ore, and it had been weathered for at least thousands of years. It was a very rare ore. It could be used in many places, but it was most commonly used on a large scale, so it was used on sculptures. In Soren's memory, there were only two places where it could be used. The first was the golem puppet. The second was the Magus Tower. Whether it was the golems or the Adept's Tower, this area was definitely the territory of a powerful adept a long time ago. Since there were artificially polished obsidian fragments here, it was highly likely that there was something related to the adepts inside. There might even be an Adept's Tower. Thinking of this, Soren's breathing quickened. Even if it was a broken Magus Tower that had been around for thousands of years, it was still very tempting to him. Even if all the functions inside were destroyed, many of the things stored inside still had astonishing value. If Soren's guess was correct, this place might be an ancient ruin left behind by the Arcane Empire. There might be information spells from the Arcane Empire that had survived, and its value was hard to estimate. "Let's go in and take a look." Soren, who was planning to leave, decided to go in and explore. He told the red-haired female pirate behind him, "Pay attention to the surroundings. Let's try not to disturb these plants. They look like they're asleep." At this time, the sky was a little dark. Soren looked up at the sky, then made a gesture to Adele Isabella beside him. The two separated and went around from the side. There were many strange trees and flowers around. They looked very large, a bit like an ancient forest. Occasionally, they would touch some leaves, and the whole plant would move a little. However, they didn't seem to attack. These strange plants seemed to only attack creatures when they were attacked or needed to eat. This was very similar to how beasts would not be aggressive when they were full. The vision in front gradually widened. Soren saw a large lavender flower. He frowned and looked at it, murmuring, "Mandala? No. It just looks a bit like it." He looked back at the red-haired female pirate and said in a deep voice, "Be careful. Let's go around." This place did not look like it grew naturally. Instead, it looked like it was artificially cultivated in the past, and then for some reason, it had survived until now. There were strange flower seeds on the ground. They seemed to be left behind by this kind of plant, but most of them did not germinate because the ground could not support so many plants. Some of the flower seeds had been damaged and disappeared, but there were still some that remained. It was just that he did not know what they were used for. Soren felt that these plants were dangerous. It was purely the intuition of an experienced rogue, so he did not dare to disturb them. Many of the plants here seemed to be alive. After bypassing these strange flowers, the outline of some broken buildings appeared in front of them. Because the weathering was too strong, and there were all kinds of strange plants growing around. Even with Soren's experience, he could not tell what it was. He could not even find an entrance to the building in front of him. Naturally, he could not judge the situation from the outside. Not all underground ruins would leave an entrance for you, or even help you to open up a tunnel to explore. In more high-end or ancient places, many underground ruins would not even leave you an entrance. What should I do then? Dig. Dig by yourself. Dig a hole, dig a tunnel. High-level adventurers often dug this way. Many sunken cities in the desert would collapse and the quicksand would pour in. Many years ago, many people dug all the way to find treasures. When Soren saw the surface of the ruins that did not even leave a hole for him, he knew that today's exploration would have to stop here. This building had completely sunk into the ground, and it might even be filled with seawater. Anyway, many things could happen. There was no way to go in now. Soren had to open up a tunnel here, then arrange for people to dig, and finally find a tunnel that could be entered together. He observed for a while. He was ready to memorize the surrounding environment and some landmarks, but at this time, the red-haired female pirate suddenly said, "Your Excellency. Look at the corner of the wall, there seems to be something wrong." Her detection ability seemed to be very strong. Soren looked at the red-haired female pirate with some surprise, and then moved towards the wall. He did not know if this woman's intuition was high or her basic skills were strong, but her detection ability seemed to be a little stronger than his. In front of Soren was a plant that looked a bit like a lantern plant. He did not dare to get too close, so he went around to the back, and then saw a strange gray crack. A spatial crack. Soren's expression was a little surprised, and he murmured, "The shadow plane? The building here is connected to the shadow plane?" It seemed to be a permanently solidified dimensional rift. Did the owner of this place in the past open up a fixed portal? The shadow plane. The non-material plane that Soren was most familiar with. He just glanced at the spatial crack in front of him, and he roughly guessed its function and reason. He was sure that he was more than 90% correct. This was not arrogance, but confidence. He had traveled to the shadow plane too many times, and he even lived in the shadow plane for a period of time. "Let's go." Soren looked up at the sky and said slowly, "We'll come back later. It's too dangerous to go in rashly now." The shadow plane was not to be trifled with. Because although the shadow plane was connected to the material plane, the environment of the two was not the same, and there may be some ancient and dangerous creatures. Moving in the shadow plane, you may encounter monsters with a challenge rating of grade 3 or above at any time, and the ratio of quasi-legendary creatures to legendary monsters was quite large, much larger than in the material plane. And there were shadow dragons in many places. The two of them carefully retreated. At this time, the camp was almost completed. Although it was still very simple, after all, it had only been a day, so Soren did not ask for anything. Today's discovery in the strange jungle was the focus of Soren's consideration. The slaves were driven together by the pirates, and after working for half a day, they also received some food at this moment. Although it was very rough and poor quality, at least it could fill their stomachs. Soren was not a stingy person. If the slaves were not fed, they would not have the strength to work. It was a very simple principle. The night passed quickly. When Soren woke up and was about to think about how to explore the strange place, the half-elf first mate walked in quickly and said, "Your Excellency. Last night, 3 slaves secretly escaped." "What?" Soren's face instantly turned pale. The half-elf first mate noticed his expression and quickly said, "But 2 of them were caught by us as soon as they ran out. The other one escaped into the jungle. I have already sent people to catch him. All of them were natives. Your Excellency, I suggest that these natives be handcuffed to work. They are much more disobedient than other slaves." Soren's face was very gloomy. After hearing the half-elf first mate's words, he gently shook his head and then said with a cold expression, "No need. Pass down my order to prepare 2 crosses and nail the 2 runaway slaves on them. The crosses will be erected at the place where the slaves are working." The half-elf first mate heard this and showed a cruel smile. He immediately nodded and said, "Okay. Your Excellency. I will do it immediately." They were pirates. Piracy was not a benevolent profession. These slaves must be taught respect. Chapter 250. A faint light appeared on the horizon. On the left side of the temporary camp, nearly 300 slaves were gathered together, trembling. In front of them was a group of pirates with fierce faces. Along with a scream not far away, 2 burly and powerful pirates walked over, one carrying 2 indigenous slaves with one hand and the other carrying them in one hand. Behind them were 4 ferocious-looking pirate minions. They each held a wooden stake, and then set up a rough cross in front of the group of slaves. "This is the fate of those who run away." The half-elf first mate's face was not very good. He was just ready to show off in front of Soren, but he didn't expect that a slave would run away the next day. This was tantamount to a slap in the face, telling Soren that he was incompetent. So now he didn't have the slightest good impression of the slaves who ran away. He even wanted to skin them alive. The half-elf first mate looked at the slaves in front of him coldly. Looking at their frightened expressions, he said in a deep voice, "All those who dare to run away, they will end up like you." Patter. The half-elf first mate glanced to the side, and then 2 burly pirates came over with 2 indigenous slaves who were obviously beaten. Then a one-eyed man with a missing left eye stood up with a grin. He held a hammer and nail in his hand. Because of the manufacturing process, the nail in this era was not the kind that we were familiar with, but the kind of conical nail that was as thick as a finger. The one-eyed man winked at the person next to him, and then someone forcibly separated the 2 slaves and fixed their limbs on the rough cross. "No. No. Please." The 2 aborigines seemed to know their fate. They couldn't help but tremble. One of them seemed to be able to speak a little bit of the common language. He kept crying and begging. The slaves below didn't dare to look at him. But no matter how he begged, it was useless. The one-eyed man raised the hammer with a grin, and then pointed the nail at his palm. With a bang, the nail that was as thick as a finger went through the palm of the indigenous slave, and then it hit the wooden stake behind him. An incomparably shrill scream sounded. The sound was very horrifying. A stream of blood flowed out of the palm that was nailed, and then dripped along the finger to the ground. The 2 indigenous slaves who were executed were trembling all over, and the voice in their mouth had changed a little. They were still begging, expressing their regret and ignorance, but in the end, there was no mercy for them. The one-eyed man continued to pick up the nail, and then nailed their other palm on the wooden stake. But this was just the beginning. This punishment used a total of 9 nails. At first, it was the palm, then the elbow, then the foot, and then the knee. As for the last nail, this was used only at the end of the punishment. When the victim was about to bleed out or was close to death, the executioner would pick up a very long and narrow nail and drive it into the victim's forehead. Under normal circumstances, the last nail was not used because it was a kind of punishment with the nature of a taboo curse. Many places believed that if the nail was pierced into the forehead, the victim's soul would be nailed to the cross, and there was a chance that this person would become a terrifying vengeful spirit. After all, the undead were supernatural creatures. Even professionals didn't dare to say that they could win against the undead. After all, they could travel between the spiritual world and the material plane. Soren watched the whole process of the execution. He must sternly stop this kind of escape. Otherwise, these slaves would become more and more unmanageable in the future. He was a person who respected the rules, and he didn't have a sense of historical mission to remove the slavery system. Because even with the technological level of his previous life, the slavery system was only removed a long time later, and the prosperous manor economy at that time was completely supported by slave labor. In his previous life, the complete removal of the slavery system was delayed until the 20th century, which showed how amazing the remaining power of this system was. Its existence was reasonable. Although it might not be a good thing, the current slavery system couldn't be shaken because many gods and churches supported the slavery system. Blood dripped down. The two indigenous slaves who were nailed to the wooden stake had begun to breathe weakly. Their initial shrill screams had changed, and now they were almost hoarse. But the whole process wasn't over yet. The blood would gradually coagulate because it wasn't a fatal wound. They still needed to be exposed to the sun for a while before they died. The punishment wouldn't end with their death. After they died, their bodies would still be nailed to the wooden frame, and then the smell of blood would attract a lot of scavengers, such as crows. Finally, the crows would begin to peck at the bodies until only the bones were left. This punishment process may last for a week. It mainly depended on how many crows were attracted, and whether the master who ordered this punishment was in a good mood. Some of the slaves below were scared silly. The two aborigines were nailed to the cross, dripping with blood, and then erected in front of them. Following that, the pirates began to instruct them to work. Because of the living example in front of them, these slaves worked very hard. Only when they stopped occasionally and saw the two of their kind nailed to the wooden stakes, would their eyes reveal a trace of sadness. However, there were also some who rejoiced in other people's misfortune. After all, half of the slaves were indigenous people, and the other half were mainland people. The indigenous people would want to escape because this was the outer islands, where they lived. But the mainland slaves would never want to escape, because they couldn't survive if they escaped. If it wasn't for the scarcity of slaves on the mainland, and because they were relatively docile and expensive, Soren really intended to buy more. Brother? Vivian's figure appeared not far away. The little girl was wearing a black princess dress. She raised her small hand and rubbed the corner of her eyes, then said, "What happened just now?" "I seemed to hear someone screaming." The little girl slept for a long time yesterday. Recently, she seemed to be very sleepy, but she didn't know the reason. Even Soren wasn't sure. However, Vivian's state was normal, and her physical condition seemed to be very good. One more obvious thing was that her strength was much greater than before. At present, she had the strength of a 12 or 13-year-old child. Maybe the little girl was developing. Soren felt that she was about 1 or 2 centimeters taller than before. Now, she was probably a little taller than Aladdin. But speaking of which, Aladdin was really short. Vivian seemed to have just woken up. She rubbed the corner of her eyes in a daze, then blinked her big eyes and looked around. When she heard the subordinate beside her explain what just happened, she couldn't help but pout and nodded seriously. It should be like this. This group of lowly slaves. As the private property of my brother, they actually dared to escape. They should be nailed to death. Let's see if they dare to escape in the future. At first, Soren was a little worried that the kind-hearted girl would reject this kind of punishment. But hearing the words from the little girl's mouth, Soren couldn't help but smile. This was his Vivian. The little girl who said, "If you kill someone, I'll help you set a fire." Kindness couldn't solve the problem. At least most of the time, kindness couldn't solve the problem. It would only make the problem worse. It wasn't time for Soren to show his kindness. Now, the outer islands could be said to be in danger at every step. There were all kinds of dangerous things and all kinds of hidden troubles. He would never allow his slaves to make trouble for him. Today, Vivian seemed to be particularly bold. She raised her hand and straightened her beautiful black princess dress, then tied her hair into a double ponytail with a hairband. The little girl had a single ponytail and a double ponytail every day. She seemed to be having a lot of fun. She tilted her head and looked at the 2 bloody indigenous slaves nailed to the wooden stake. Then, she turned around and looked at the other busy slaves. 2 of the slaves immediately knelt down when they saw her and kowtowed with an excited expression. It seemed that she had used magic to save the 2 guys. The little girl nodded reservedly. She looked down at them like a noble princess and said, "Work hard. I remember my brother said that as long as you work hard, some of you will be granted freedom." My brother always keeps his words. I believe you will soon be free. Chapter 251. The others obviously didn't believe the little girl's words. He had never heard of a slave owner who would generously grant freedom to the slaves in front of him, let alone give freedom to a portion of them. Most of the slaves showed a trace of doubt on their faces. Some of them even had a mocking expression, thinking that this was a trick to fool them into working hard. However, the two northern slaves who were saved by Vivian were pleasantly surprised. They seemed to believe the words of the little angel-like girl in front of them. It didn't matter whether the slaves believed it or not. Because the supervisors were the fierce and cruel pirates. If the slaves didn't work hard, they believed that the pirates who were used to seeing blood and cruel means had ways to make them obedient. This was the advantage of being a pirate. With such a group of subordinates, they could do things without rules. Their cruelty and bloodthirstiness could help Soren solve a lot of problems. Some of the things that couldn't be seen in the light of day didn't even need to be done by him. The pirate leader below had already helped him solve it. Anyway, Soren wasn't a kind and noble person. So what if the means were cruel? Now, only cruel means could make them obedient. The punishment over there was still continuing. The two natives who escaped were almost dead after being exposed to the sun for a whole morning. Soren thought about it and didn't let his subordinates hammer the nails into their foreheads. Instead, he let them die on the wooden stakes and then handed them to the scavenger birds that were attracted. Nailing the nails into the foreheads could really give birth to the undead. Although Soren wasn't afraid at all, he hated troublesome things. The two natives didn't last long. Their vitality wasn't strong enough. They died on the first day, but their bodies were still standing in the place where the slaves worked. At the latest, crows, vultures, and seabirds would appear tomorrow. At noon. The half-elf first mate's face didn't look very good. He came over and whispered, "Your Excellency. One of the slaves who escaped is missing. We couldn't track him down. Your subordinates are useless. 3 escaped and 2 were caught." After Soren heard the other party's words, he frowned slightly, then waved his hand and said, "Forget it." There was no need to care about him anymore. He ordered the others to prepare to lay the foundation. "Then you take some people to the City of Wealth. I need some dwarven craftsmen. It's best if they know how to bake bricks and build furnaces. Find a way to poach other people with construction skills. Don't worry about the price. Snake Island still has a sum of money. You can take it out and use it at any time." The half-elf first mate quickly nodded and said, "No problem. This kind of construction craftsman is easy to find. There are also some dwarves in the City of Wealth. I will definitely find a way to bring them over." Speaking of this, a cold light flashed in his eyes. He had already messed up once, so he couldn't mess it up again. This time, even if he had to kidnap them, he had to kidnap them. In any case, they were pirates. Pirates did not need to reason with people. If they recruited people through normal means, there might be all kinds of messy requests and matters. He just brought people with him and went over with knives. He wanted to see who would dare not come. Now, anyone with a discerning eye could see that His Excellency Throat Cutter was preparing to establish a foundation here. Whether or not he could perform well would determine his future status. "You may leave." Soren nodded gently and said, "You go and call Adele in, and then call One-Eyed Dragon." The half-elf first mate responded and retreated. After a while, the figure of the red-haired female pirate appeared outside the tent. She came in and bowed slightly, then said, "What are your orders?" Soren looked up at her, then handed over a white stone and directly ordered, "This is a guano stone. It's a very valuable fertilizer. It can be used on crops after a little refining. It can greatly increase the yield of crops. You take people to send this stone to the Alchemy Guild of the Wizard Alliance. I believe they will be interested in this stone. Just send it over. If they are interested, let them send someone to talk to me." Guano stone? The red-haired female pirate's expression was a little puzzled. Although she had mastered a lot of knowledge, she didn't know much about farming. However, this didn't affect her understanding of the meaning of fertilizer. So she immediately nodded and said, "I'll go now. I promise to send it over." "Very good." Soren nodded slightly and said in a deep voice, "I've asked people to prepare 3 boxes of samples. You can send them directly by a fast ship, and then help me purchase the things on the order." Speaking of this, Soren took out a list and said, "There is still a sum of money in Port Tylon. You can go and get it. The things I need must be delivered, and the things I need must be brought back next month." Adele Isabella nodded with a serious expression and said, "Yes, sir. I promise to complete the task." Soren waved his hand gently. The red-haired female pirate couldn't help but look back at him before going out. Then she went out and met a ferocious-looking one-eyed dragon and a bald, hook-nosed pirate. The 2 men glanced at the red-haired female pirate slightly. Their expressions didn't seem to be too respectful. However, after walking into the tent, they were a lot more honest. They quickly bowed their heads respectfully and said, "Your Excellency." The hook-nosed pirate was the first to speak. He bowed slightly and said, "3 of us were bitten today. There are too many poisonous insects and snakes here. The brothers below are a little frightened. Your Excellency, are we going to scatter the powder we brought over?" Soren stood up when he heard the words. He went outside the tent and looked up at the sky. The sun was better today. He thought for a moment and said, "Wait until noon to scatter it. Scatter it around the camp. First, let people pay attention to cleaning up the surroundings. The environment here was very bad. There were many poisonous insects and snakes overseas. If you were accidentally bitten, it would be troublesome. If you were lightly bitten, you would bleed and bleed. If you were seriously poisoned, you would die. Even the mosquitoes here could cause wound infection and worsen." When Soren came, he considered all aspects. He was a person who planned and acted. He did bring a lot of insect repellent powder, but it was not to deal with these poisonous insects, but to deal with more troublesome things. But now that there were almost a dozen non-combat casualties, it was better to scatter the powder quickly. Ah! Suddenly, a scream came from outside. Then, a small pirate leader ran in. He said a few words outside, and someone came in to report, "Your Excellency." A slave dug up a hibernating snake and was bitten by it. Monkey drained his blood to expel the poison, but the snake seems to be very poisonous. The slave can't be saved. Damn it. What a stupid guy. A hibernating snake could bite him? The climate of the outer islands was tropical. The winter here was very short, and many poisonous snakes did not hibernate. The temperature here was much higher, and there was basically no ice and snow. But in an area with such a climate, it was easy to breed mosquitoes and snakes. Sometimes, there was no way to deal with these environmental factors. They could only passively deal with it. This was something that people who had been to primitive forests or other wild areas would understand. Soren frowned and rubbed his forehead. Then, he said in a deep voice, "Clean up this area first. Set it on fire. Get someone to prepare a fire and smoke it. Then scatter the powder. It should not rain today. As long as it didn't rain, it would be fine. If it did, all the powder would go to waste." Soren's men immediately went to carry out the order. Then, they saw the slaves and pirates clearing the bushes near the camp. All the weeds and bushes were cut down and dug up. Then, they set fire to the grass on all sides. A thick plume of smoke rose into the sky. Following the spread of the fire and the scattering of the powder, a dense swarm of insects could be seen burrowing out from the underbrush. The sheer number of insects was enough to make one's scalp tingle. Many ferocious and cruel pirates felt goosebumps all over their bodies. Damn it! A strong northern pirate cursed. He couldn't help but tremble and murmured, "There are so many insects down there. I even slept there last night." How many insects were there? It wasn't easy to count, but there should be thousands. As long as there was fire and powder scattered, there would be one or two insects crawling out. Soren frowned slightly as he looked at the smoke rising from the fire. He glanced at his men next to him, then ordered a group of people to guard the perimeter. If there were indigenous tribes nearby, they might be discovered by the smoke. It was best to set up a sentry. The indigenous people were very xenophobic. After they discovered Soren and the others, the possibility of them attacking was quite high. It took an afternoon. All the pirates and slaves cleared all the weeds and bushes near the camp together. With the camp as the center, Soren ordered all the weeds and bushes to be burned and dug up. The outside of the camp was all freshly turned over soil, scattered with powder. There was no hiding place in this area, and the field of vision was very wide. Basically, there was nothing to hide. At the same time, there were a lot of logs piled up in the corner of the camp. The first step of construction was obviously still the need for wood. Soren's plan was to first build a simple fence, then build a house with logs, and then expand it further. As for food and other materials, he could ship them over. As one of the 3 pirate kings, Soren could mobilize a lot of resources. There was nothing to worry about in terms of wood. There was a virgin forest everywhere. Now, it was his men who were chopping the wood, so the progress was still relatively slow. When Soren cut the wood himself and practiced his swordsmanship, that would be the time for the progress bar to skyrocket. He was a jack of all trades. The job of cutting wood could train a lot of combat skills, especially violent sword attacks. Chapter 252. The houses in this world were relatively simple and rough. If someone was familiar with European history or tried the game from other time periods, they would find that the houses they lived in were relatively simple and rough. Some of the wood used to build the houses was not even shaved clean. It was completely different from the Central Plains at the same time period. But this was also good. Building a house could be said to be very fast. As long as there were enough carpenters, they could quickly build a house. In the future, when Soren made red bricks, these temporary wooden houses could be retired. As for the other very important part, the cement that everyone was familiar with, it was actually not that important. As early as thousands of years ago on Earth, there was a building method of digging trenches, filling burning soil, and using wood to support mud walls. Even if there was no cement, clay, gypsum, lime and so on could be used as a blending agent. It was just that the house that was cut out in the end was not as strong as reinforced concrete, and there was no way to build it too high. Most of the houses in this world were one-story bungalows. If the second floor was intended to be an attic, it could be a structure of wood mixed with bricks. Soren's plan took a lot of things into consideration. A day passed quickly. Soren sent out half of his men, mainly to continue to transport supplies. Although 6 ships of supplies were enough for them to eat and wear for more than 3 months, it was not enough for them to build a town. Before the infrastructure here was completed and could be self-sufficient, everything needed to rely on Port Tylon as a transit station. Most of the other pirates thought that Soren intended to build a base in the outer islands. They never thought that his plan was bigger than everyone thought. Pirate kings basically had overseas lairs, such as the Swamp King's Devil Island, or the Naga Pirate King's Angry Scales Island. In fact, most people thought that Soren was preparing to build his lair in the outer islands, and then control a large number of pirates to control the sea route. In the future, he could rely on this sea route to make money. The next morning, after Soren divided the simple camp area, he began to join the labor process. Although he knew that there were still many things that he needed to explore, he still patiently focused on the construction of the camp. As long as the camp was completed, this area would be his territory. Even if he was attacked, he could defend himself. In the future, he could slowly explore the surrounding area. However, if the camp was not established, it would be quite troublesome if they were attacked by the indigenous people. Perhaps the pirates wouldn't suffer too many casualties, but most of the slaves would die. Resources, population, and land. Soren silently stood up and glanced at Vivian, who was flipping through a book with her head tilted to one side. She was even using her small white hand to hold a quill and scribble on a piece of white paper. He couldn't help but smile. Vivian's innate profession was a warlock. A warlock didn't need to learn too many things. Casting spells was completely dependent on one's innate ability. However, Vivian also had a part-time job as a wizard. What she was doing now was learning magic knowledge by herself and using the wizard's way to master casting skills. He took a look and left. The little girl was more obedient than before. She seemed to know that he had a very important plan, and most of the time, she would quietly do her own things. Soren quickly led a group of people towards the forest. Yesterday, a lot of trees were cut down, but they were only used to build tents. Today, more wood was needed. It was best to make a part of the fence outside. For this reason, Soren had to do it himself. Brute force. Soren looked at the trees in front of him. First, he blessed himself with a strength spell, and then he walked to a trunk as thick as his thigh. He took a deep breath. With a clang, the legendary curved sword Icing Death appeared with a cold light, and then the tree in front of him was cut off. With a creaking sound, a big tree fell down. Soren didn't even look at it again. The pirate minions behind him went into battle with their swords and axes. After a while, the branches above were cut off. Soon, a simple log appeared on the spot. Two burly and majestic pirates came from behind, each carrying one side of the log, and walked away. At this time, Soren had already cut down 3 big trees in front of him. 20 or 30 pirate minions spread out and chopped with their swords and axes for a while. They piled the branches on the other side to make a fire, and then let the others carry the 3 logs back. Houses were being built in the camp, and the fence outside was also being raised. This amount of wood was simply not enough. Soren's cutting speed was very fast. He almost maintained the speed of cutting down 3 trees in a minute. After cutting down a tree with his sword, he rested for more than 10 seconds, and then cut down another tree. There were already a large number of pirate minions behind him. Now there were at least 60 or 70 people. Even with so many people behind him to deal with the trees that had been cut down, there were still more than 20 that had not been dealt with yet. Outside, the pirates responsible for carrying the logs back were all tired and sweating profusely. Soren's breathing was still very steady. His extraordinary physique was undoubtedly revealed in this situation. He continuously cut down 50 trees before stopping. He let out a small breath and relaxed his arms. His arms were numb from the continuous exertion of force. The pirate minions behind him were all busy. They hurriedly gathered the other logs that had been cut down and sent them back to the camp to build a fence. Soren naturally didn't stop because his body couldn't take it anymore. It was only because the duration of the brute force spell was up. Cutting down trees required the support of strength. Without the buff spell, his efficiency would be greatly reduced. However, Soren had already memorized a large number of spells in advance. Not only did he memorize the brute force spell for all the second circle spell slots, he also memorized the brute force spell for the third circle spell slots. What he just used was the normal version of the brute force spell. If it was the third circle brute force spell, Soren's spell effect and duration would be increased by 50%. This was the value of the brute force spell. Soren's efficiency was indeed quite amazing. In just 1 or 2 hours, he had already cut down hundreds of trees. After that, a large group of pirate minions were busy handling the logs and transporting them back. Now, the fence of the entire camp was partially completed. The slaves were under the command of the pirate leader to drive the logs into the ground. It was estimated that a sturdy wooden fence would be completed in 1 or 2 days. And this was only the beginning. Soren wanted to build more than just a fence here. Chapter 253. The construction of the camp was still ongoing. Soren personally cut down the logs at a very fast speed. The number of pirates who were responsible for transporting the logs had increased to more than 100. The logs were sent back to the camp and then cut into wood by the craftsmen or those who were proficient in the craft. Some of the logs were directly dug into the ground to build fences, which were about 5 meters high and had simple arrow towers. Pirates often built their camps on the islands, so this kind of work was common among the pirates. Sauron was busy chopping wood and practicing his sword techniques at the same time. Vivian was bored after reading for a while. She took out a scroll and flipped through it, then directly walked out of the tent. Many pirates respected this cute little girl. First of all, those who didn't respect her were thrown into the sea to feed the fish by Sauron. Second of all, this cute little girl who looked harmless was a terrifying wizard. Her status was aloof and independent of the pirate group. Even the half-elf first mate would answer the little girl's questions honestly when he met her. Oh. Vivian tilted her head and looked at the slaves and pirates who were busy working outside. To be honest, their labor efficiency was not high. Although there were alchemy machines similar to excavators in this world, they were all things that only high-level spellcasters could afford. Currently, the construction of the entire camp was done by manual labor. They only relied on a few simple tools. The drainage ditch outside the tent was dug with a hoe. In this case, it was easy to imagine that the construction efficiency was not high, and the manpower used was also quite large. The little girl looked at it for a while, then took out a thick book from thin air. It was about the thickness of a chinois dictionary. There was a row of strange words written on it, but the general meaning could be understood. On the cover, it was written, "The Wizard Tower Construction *Guide* and the Golem Guard's Manual." This book might not have been preserved very well. Some of the words on the cover had fallen off, and there were some stains on the front part. It was probably a book that had been preserved for a long time. A wizard's knowledge was very precious, especially the books that wizards needed. Most of these books were not printed, and they were written by their own hands bit by bit. This was the wealth that they had accumulated in their lifetime. Sauron was a person who respected knowledge, so although the little girl did not like to read, she was very protective of books. She was a good child who listened to her brother. Vivian casually found a place to sit down. Then, she closed her little knees and flipped open the thick book that was even bigger than her face. She flipped through the book at a rather fast speed. In just a short while, she had flipped through about 100 pages. Then, she stopped at one of the pages and lifted her little white finger to point at a line of words. Then, she flipped to the next page. There were many words and pictures there. The little girl frowned and looked at it for a while, then murmured, "The best material for building a wizard tower is not any stone, but stone made with the mud to stone spell. This kind of stone is quite strong. After a simple enchantment, it can reach the level of hardness above marble." She turned to the second page and continued to read, "If combined with the magic arts left over from the Arcane Empire, mud to stone can make the stones made by magic as hard as steel." She did not know if it was deliberately erased by someone, or if it was unintentionally damaged by time. All the information about the mud to rock spell and how hard it was to turn the stones into steel through alchemy had become stains that couldn't be seen clearly. Vivian's brows furrowed as she read this, and she couldn't help but say angrily, "Which bastard did this?" She lifted her little hand and kept flipping to the back. However, the back had already turned to the layout of the wizard tower. There was no mention of the overall construction material of the wizard tower. The little girl was so angry that she directly threw the thick book into the dimensional belt. Then, she held her chin with her little hand and said, "It's a pity that my spell slots are not enough. Otherwise, I can help my brother build a camp with mud to stone." Oh. The book that Sister Gloria gave me seems to have recorded that this spell changes the soil according to the casting level and casting strength. It seems that every point is about 2 feet square. I wonder how large the area I can change. Yes. I'll try it when I have time. The little girl tilted her head and muttered for a while. Then, she seemed to feel a little sleepy and could not help but walk into the tent. Recently, she had been more sleepy, but what made her happy was that she had grown taller. Mud to stone, level 5 spell. The spellcaster can transform soil into stone. This transformation process is permanent. Every point of spell strength can transform 2 feet square of soil. Many building materials, including the structure of the wizard tower, are made of mud to stone. The effect of this spell will be permanently changed after use. Spells such as Dispel Magic cannot be used to remove the transformation effect. Phew. Soren took a deep breath and put away the curved sword in his hand. A large area of the nearby trees had been cut down by him. Perhaps it was because everything had to start from scratch. He actually felt like he had returned to the slash-and-burn era. In fact, the fastest way was to rely on the power of the wizards. However, he did not have any spellcasters, so he could only use the simplest way to open up the camp. There was a level 5 wizard spell called Mud to Stone. This spell could directly turn soil into stone. At that time, there was a guild with rich spellcasters who directly relied on spells to build a city wall in a day. However, there was still a big limit to the spell slots. If the goddess of magic died, the spell slots would be converted into mana. At that time, although the spellcasting ability of the wizards would be weakened, they would have a lot more freedom to cast spells. If all the mana was invested into the level 5 spell Mud to Stone, only a small number of wizards would be able to achieve amazing results. The creation ability of the wizards could not be ignored in the pioneering tactics of the past, especially the development of the outer planes and the abyss. Soren put away his sword and looked behind him. The pirate minions were still busy moving the logs. He took a deep breath and then looked at his data display. He found that there was an extra row of words on it: training successful. You have obtained part of the information of sword form, horizontal slash. Training successful. You have obtained part of the information of sword form, horizontal slash. Training successful. You have mastered the combat skill, sword form, horizontal slash. Sword form, horizontal slash. It was a more basic combat skill of the sword form. In fact, it was a prerequisite skill of the sword form, waist slash. This was the easiest sword form skill to master in logging. Its combat effect was similar to the sword form, heavy slash. Its strength was strengthened to Soren's current standard, especially after his attributes were increased. These more basic sword force abilities were all integrated into his normal attacks. This was because this kind of force exertion technique no longer caused him too much of a burden. With enough attribute points as a foundation, he slightly skipped the previous requirement of charging force. As long as he did not use it consecutively, he could use it in his normal attacks. There were actually many types of sword forms. Basically, they were suitable for most weapon attacks. If a melee profession did not have a combat specialty, they would have to train and master enough combat skills. It was said that there were more than 100 types of sword forms. The foundation for a grand swordsman to advance into a legendary was to understand these basic sword forms. Soren did not have any mandatory requirements for sword forms. However, mastering more sword forms would increase his combat power. Moreover, many powerful combat skills in the future would require the coordination of basic sword forms. For example, mastering sword form, horizontal slash, would have a strong effect when comprehending and using sword form, beheading, in the future. Many sword forms and skills were interconnected. Yellow sand was flying all over the sky. A slightly stooped figure was moving forward at the edge of the desert. Judging from his face, he did not seem to be very old. However, his face was full of vicissitudes and fatigue. His hair seemed to have not been washed for a long time. There was stubble on his chin, and there was a lot of dust in his hair. He was wearing mottled armor. There were sword marks on his shoulder armor. There was a bandage on his arm, and there was a trace of blood seeping out from it. The originally bright silver armor seemed to be a little dim at the moment. It seemed that it had not been maintained for a long time. It looked very worn out. There was a long sword on his waist. From time to time, he looked up into the distance. His hands seemed to be hanging on the hilt, ready to fight at any time. This was a young paladin. Or rather, he used to be a paladin. Now, he was just a wandering warrior. He seemed to have been walking for a long time. Even the sturdy and durable boots on his feet were almost worn out. However, he still did not stop, as if there was something very important waiting for him in front of him. The wind stirred up the sand and dust. Soon, his whole body was gray and covered with a layer of dust. The young warrior shook his clothes, shaking off the dust on the ground, and then continued to move forward silently. His lips were a little chapped, and there were bloodstains at the corners of his mouth. However, he didn't drink any water, because there wasn't much water left on him. Just like that, he kept walking forward. When it got dark, he would stop to camp and eat some hard rations. He didn't need a tent, so he just leaned against the corner and slept with his clothes on. His hands were always holding his sword, and even when he slept, he hugged it to his chest. He did not know how long he had been walking. It was not until an old middle-aged man appeared in front of him that he stopped. He knelt in front of the other party on one knee, inserted the long sword into the ground, and pressed his palm on his chest. This was the etiquette of a paladin. The other party seemed to have expected his arrival. He just said in a hoarse voice, "What have you learned along the way?" The young paladin looked up. There seemed to be a trace of sadness in his eyes, but more than that, he said slowly, "There is something called justice, and justice requires great strength. P.S. There were a lot of things today. It took me a long time to write this. On the 11th day of quitting smoking, I gained more than a pound." Chapter 254. Time passed day by day. In the blink of an eye, Soren had been here for 5 days. The camp was completely different from when he first arrived. Outside the camp, there was a 5-meter-tall fence. Every 100 meters, there was a simple arrow tower. It was the kind of tower that could be reached by climbing up a ladder. There were 4 gates in the camp. The east was where Soren lived, the west was where the other pirates lived, the south was where a large amount of materials were stored, and the north was where a large number of slaves were locked up. The layout of the camp was square. There were specially dug drainage channels on both sides of the road. There were even toilets built on all 4 sides. This was something that the other pirates couldn't understand. This was because this era was dirty and messy. Even in the developed cities along the coast, there were very few toilets. Many people would just go to the alleys to relieve themselves. However, this was very important to Soren. Even though he used to live in the slums, when he had the ability to directly plan, the first order he gave was to build toilets. From today onwards, no one was allowed to relieve themselves in the camp. If they wanted to relieve themselves, they had to go to the toilets. If anyone dared to relieve themselves in the camp, they would be caught and their tools would be chopped off. Sanitation was the most important thing. This was because the environment of the outer islands was very easy to breed mosquitoes. If the disease spread, it was definitely not something that Soren wanted to see. Moreover, no one would like to accidentally step on other people's urine in their own territory. Even though Soren wasn't a clean freak, this was still a very important point. At this moment, looking down from the sky, the camp was an irregular square. It looked a bit like a Greek village. There was a large square in the middle, mainly for the convenience of gathering people. The 4 sides were divided by 2 intersecting streets. The ground was flattened. Even though the roads were made of mud, there were ditches dug around the roads. There were also a few wells nearby that could drain the dirty water. There were many houses in the camp that were being built, but most of them weren't completed yet. The only thing that was completed was the warehouse. This was mainly because they were afraid of the rain. The warehouse had to be completed as soon as possible. This was even more important than Soren's house, because many of the materials could not be exposed to the rain. The food reserves were enough to last them for more than 3 months, but it was better to store the food in the warehouse. Things like smoked meat were fine, but other things would quickly become moldy if they were exposed to moisture. In the place where the slaves worked, there were 2 crosses. The corpses on top were almost turned into white bones. The whole process could be said to be very cruel. Many slaves were so scared that they didn't dare to look over here, even until today. The 2 wooden stakes had to be erected for another 2 days. During these 7 days, they had attracted many vultures and crows. These scavenging birds were openly pecking at the corpses, causing many people to have a headache just by looking at them. The effect of torture was undoubtedly effective. At least during this period of time, the slaves were very honest. And because Soren told the pirate minions not to whip them too much, and to give them more food, the slaves had to work hard every day, but at least they could still fill their stomachs. And yesterday, due to His Excellency Throat Cutter's impromptu fishing, the shark caught was too much meat to finish. He only took the shark fins and so on, and then the slaves ate fish soup to their heart's content. This place was actually very good. Although it was primitive and barren, and there were many dangerous things, such as annoying mosquitoes, the resources here were indeed very rich. Some slaves caught a kind of fat vole when they worked, and the indigenous slaves ate it directly. The other slaves brought it back and ate it by fire. Here, they ate better than in the past. From time to time, they would have some meat and fish, mainly because the nearby sea area had not been developed much, and they could pick up big crabs on the beach. In some ways, this place really felt like the Great Northwest. The slaves themselves were people who had nothing, so their requirements were not very high. As long as they could fill their stomachs while working hard, and occasionally have a little meat, many people would be able to restrain their thoughts. After all, Soren had clearly told them that the fate of escaping and being caught was very miserable. Even after death, they would not be easily free. Moreover, there were still some slaves who believed what Vivian said. When the time was right, Soren would give freedom to some of the hard-working people. Inside the big tent in the center, Soren frowned as he scribbled on a piece of white paper. He looked up at the sky and murmured, "They should have returned to Port Thailand by now, right? It will take half a month to go back and forth. I should be able to bring back what I need in January next year, and then I can start the next step of the plan." The end of December. It looks like the new year is coming, right? Soren walked out of the tent and silently calculated in his heart. He found that it was indeed the new year in a few days. In this world, there were no strong New Year celebrations, but the tradition of preparing for the new year was still there. When Soren came, it was the middle of December. Now it was the end of December, and the new year was coming in a few days. The new year was actually not that bad. The most important thing in this world was the Harvest Festival. This was the grandest celebration of the year. And this celebration was common to most gods. In the south, they sacrificed to the goddess of agriculture; in the north, and in the coastal areas, they sacrificed to the goddess of the sea. Even the drows would pray to the queen of spiders for a year's harvest during the Harvest Festival every year. After all, for any race, filling their stomachs was the most basic and most important thing. Soren looked outside and walked towards the sea. He let his pirate leaders drive away 2 ships, but there were still some warships left outside. The cargo ships of the Chamber of Commerce also went back. Soren's order was a large amount of materials. They would take 3 months to ship a part of it every half a month. The most important part was the slave resources. If Soren wanted to develop and grow, he could not do without labor. In a short period of time, the pirates would not rebel, but if they were really used as labor, these pirates would complain. For now, they knew that the base camp had just been built, and no one could avoid hard work. When the base camp was built, these pirates would not be so diligent. On the other side, Vivian's petite figure squatted next to a mud pit. Her white little hands played with a pile of mud as if she was molding a clay figurine. She used her small hands to mold the mud into various shapes. The little girl squatted beside the mud pit and seemed to have played for a long time. Even her snow-white princess dress was stained with mud. After about 10 minutes, she kneaded the mud into what looked like a cube. Then, she raised her small hand and began to cast a spell. Mud to stone. A faint magic aura emerged, and the mud in front of her gradually turned into stone, but it did not seem to be solid. It looked like the kind that was weathered. The little girl's expression seemed to be a little annoyed. She kicked the mud away and murmured, "It's so difficult. Why is it so difficult to learn spells above the 5th circle? Obviously, 4th circle spells are quite easy, but why does the difficulty increase so much after entering the 5th circle?" "Lillian?" Why do you think we can't master this spell? There was a short silence. Then Lillian said a little matter-of-factly, I don't have to go through so much trouble to learn spells. Those who need to learn spells are not real geniuses. Yes. That's it. Needless to say. Vivian also knew that she asked in vain. The little girl got up and snapped her fingers. Then there was a faint magic aura, and then her body became clean. Vivian clapped her little hands, raised her hand to tidy up her skirt, and then planned to go back to sleep. But at this moment, she heard a noise coming from the bushes in the distance, and then a figure rushed out from inside. It was an ugly man with a tattoo on his face. His ears were full of earrings, and there was a scar on his skull. This was a pirate. There were a lot of strange people among Sauron's men. Anyway, there were very few guys who could be considered as good-looking. He was a sentry sent out to monitor the movements nearby. Vivian's face did not show the slightest panic. Although she was only a little girl who had just turned 9 years old, she was quite calm at this time. The little girl approached little by little, while also paying attention to the nearby movements. She saw a blow dart on the back of the pirate's sentinel in front of her. It was a weapon as slender as a needle. Most of it was smeared with a rather potent poison. It either had the effect of sealing one's throat upon contact with blood, or was able to quickly anesthetize a person to death. The little girl approached carefully, and at the same time, she had several spells on her body. The bushes in the distance moved a little. However, no one chased out. When Vivian walked over, the pirate was not completely unconscious, but he said in a somewhat intermittent voice, Miss. Native. After saying that, he directly fainted. It seemed that the blow dart had a nerve anesthetic on it, and not a poison that could kill blood. This kind of thing was very troublesome. It had to be a compulsory test of vitality. Maybe Soren had a higher chance of passing it, but the other pirates would have a hard time resisting it. Vivian stretched out her finger to check his breath. After confirming that he was not dead, she ran toward the camp. The natives had appeared. This must be told to Brother quickly, because the natives were very xenophobic, and it was very likely that they would attack. Chapter 255. Inside the tent. Soren stood in the middle with a serious expression. In front of him was a man who was surprisingly well-dressed among the pirates. He even wore a monocle. But don't underestimate this guy. Looking at the calluses on his slender palms, you could see that he was an expert in using short weapons. He also had good throwing knife skills. He was one of the few pirates who could read and learn. He was also a doctor among the pirates. He was proficient in various surgical operations and had quite good medical skills. This man who looked like a noble tutor reached out and checked the breath of the unconscious man on the ground. Then he opened his eyelids and looked at his tongue. He slowly said, "Your Excellency." It seems that he wasn't poisoned, just temporarily unconscious. However, when he would be able to wake up would depend on his physique. Under normal circumstances, he should be able to wake up tomorrow morning. This guy's physique is still very good. Soren heard this and nodded. Then he walked around in a circle. He had actually sent out quite a number of scouts, but it seemed like only one of the 5 would return. If the other 4 didn't die in the hands of the Aborigines, they should have been caught by them. The area of this island was actually quite large. It was about 500 square kilometers. Because of the tropical rainforest-like climate and the fact that it was connected to other islands, there was a high possibility that there would be an Aboriginal tribe here. Soren had long sent people to explore the nearby area. For this reason, he lost 3 to 5 people. At present, the exploration of the entire island was mainly concentrated around 10 kilometers around the camp. The most dangerous place was still the remains of those strange plants. Soren himself didn't dare to easily explore the secret. Then the more dangerous place was near the southern coast. There was a high cliff where about 3 groups of about 10 large pterosaurs lived. Then there was the direction near the northwest. After passing through the jungle and a big river, there was another place full of strange flowers and plants. Unsurprisingly, the Aboriginal tribe was there. It was about 30 kilometers away from Soren. There were several more dangerous areas in between, including the territory of some dangerous and fierce creatures in the outer islands. Your Excellency. A bald and ugly pirate raised his head to look at Soren and cautiously asked, "Do you want us to teach those native monkeys a lesson?" Soren turned around and looked at him. He slowly shook his head and said, "There's no rush. After all, this is still their territory. These Aborigines are more familiar with the terrain than we are. The most important thing for us is to figure out our surroundings and make sure that there are no creatures like army ants or flying insects nearby. Then, we can have a good fight with them. If we want to turn this place into our territory, we have to get rid of these Aborigines. It's fine if we don't make a move, but once we do, it must be a thunderous one." He couldn't act rashly. Soren was very clear about the troubles of the Aborigines. Because they had a scattered tribal system, they were maintained by the same totem beliefs and in-laws. There were very troublesome relationships between the tribes. He didn't want an endless war, so once he started a war with the indigenous people, he had to defeat them with a thunderous force. Otherwise, it would be a nightmare for these guys to hide and harass him. The indigenous people had a semi-slavery system. The main members of the labor force were ordinary people and slaves. Most of the slaves came from the wars between the tribes. The indigenous people belonged to a sense of separation between soldiers and farmers. The indigenous people who were qualified to become professionals would be selected, trained, and then participate in hunting operations. These indigenous people were first-class warriors and hunters. They were quite dangerous, more dangerous than many professionals. The challenge level of the entire outer islands was raised by them. This group of people could be regarded as warriors who had been trained since childhood. They were proficient in sneaking, archery, tracking, and other skills. Most of their tasks were hunting and fighting. The wars between the indigenous tribes were cruel and bloody. They occurred frequently throughout the outer islands. In the structure of an indigenous tribe, the most important thing was the shaman priests and combat members. Most of the other ordinary people served as labor force. The hierarchy in the tribe was quite strict. The strength of a tribe was measured not only by the population, but also by the proportion of warriors in the population. Because for the indigenous people, they only needed to conquer and defeat a tribe to capture a large number of slaves. These people were actually wealth and goods like gold. The slave trade in the outer islands was also developed in this way. Most of the indigenous slaves were not warriors. They lived a slave-like life from childhood and were responsible for supporting the entire tribe. Soren took out a quill pen and drew a few circles on the map. Those were the areas that had been explored. Because he was responsible for guarding the camp, the pirates would go out to investigate. The 5 most dangerous places were in the south, west, and north of the camp. The first was the place with strange plants, the second was the nest of large pterosaur, the third was the swamp area occupied by crocodiles, the fourth was the territory of a group of man-eating insects, and the last was the river that divided the island in the middle. This river passed through the entire island, flowed from the inlaid islands next to it, and then flowed to the sea. Strictly speaking, this river was the most dangerous place, but it was only when people fell in. This was because there were a large number of piranhas that were only half the size of a palm. These piranhas had very sharp teeth. When they moved in groups, they could eat any creature that fell into the water. Even an elephant could be eaten clean in a short period of time. In the end, not even the bones were left behind. This kind of piranha was distributed in many places in the outer islands. This was one of them. The number was huge to millions, and they were very sensitive to the smell of blood. To cross the river, one must rely on a boat. Even the indigenous people couldn't swim over, not to mention the large electric eels in it. Electric eels were creatures that could electrocute an adult man near land. It was even more difficult to deal with them here. The large electric eels were almost as fast as a spell attack. The intensity of the electric current was quite dangerous. Some of the special electric eel bosses could directly electrocute a grade 3 profession. Your Excellency. A one-eyed pirate next to him looked at Soren, who was in deep thought, and carefully said, "What do we do now? Don't we care about them? If we don't teach those indigenous monkeys a lesson, I'm afraid they'll think we're easy to deal with." The indigenous people deserved a beating. Their xenophobia was quite strong. If you didn't kill them, they would treat you as a soft persimmon. Even the pirates knew about this. Soren looked up at them and said, "Don't care about them for now. You guys prepare enough food and bring out the wine on the ship. It's almost the new year. Let the others have some good wine and meat first. Then we'll deal with them. During this time, I'll personally investigate them. For now, don't move too far away from the camp." Because Soren didn't touch a drop of alcohol, the pirates also banned alcohol during this time. The pirates below had already complained, but because they were afraid of Soren's prestige, no one dared to say it out loud. There were many drunkards among the pirates. During this time, there were also many who secretly drank a few mouthfuls, but there were still few who drank openly. There were too many pirates who were addicted to alcohol. Soren had to control them. Otherwise, there would be people who were drunk all day long. Soren wasn't against them drinking, but when it came to serious business, he definitely wouldn't allow people to drink and mess things up. The group of pirates quickly retreated from the tent. Although they didn't understand why Soren wanted them to celebrate the new year, the pirates below were really tired. There were already many who were complaining. Now that they were celebrating with wine and meat, it would be better to appease them. After all, pirates weren't soldiers. Their discipline was very low, and they obeyed orders out of respect. The ban on alcohol was lifted, and soon there were cheers in the camp. Many of the pirates secretly took out a small bottle and put it to their mouth to take a big gulp. This was the pirates' usual equipment, and it was filled with strong rum. This kind of rum had a high alcohol content, and it could be used to disinfect when necessary. It was a habit passed down from the northern pirates. Perhaps it was because the new year was coming, but the pirates' tempers were much better. They didn't even beat or scold the slaves. Boxes of supplies were moved out. There were smoked meat, vegetables, salted fish, and so on. Soren actually prepared a lot of things, including things that the pirates didn't think would be useful. A day passed just like that. Soren looked at the rare happy atmosphere in the camp, and the corner of his mouth showed a trace of a smile, but it seemed a little cruel. Let them have a good new year. He looked up and murmured, "Next year will be the most difficult year. Whether we can gain a foothold here will depend on whether we can get rid of the indigenous people next year. The other dangerous areas and all kinds of wild monsters could wait. Because the monsters had an area of activity. If no one provoked them, the monsters in the outer islands wouldn't easily run to other places, including the most aggressive and predatory large pterosaur. Most of their hunting areas were fixed. So the most troublesome thing was the indigenous people. As long as the indigenous people were defeated, there would be time to clean up other small problems. Moreover, for Soren, the indigenous people had a greater meaning. He needed slave labor for his development, and in the end, he would have to find a solution from the indigenous people. If this was the case, then things would have to be carefully planned. P.S. After some adjustment, I'm in a much better state. I'm back to normal. There will be more at the end of the month. Chapter 256. In the evening. Soren had changed into a tight suit. He cut his shoulder-length hair with a curved sword and cut it to about the length of his earlobe. At this moment, his appearance was a little different from before. There was almost nothing on his body. His wrists and legs were wrapped with cloth strips, and he didn't wear any armor, not even light leather armor. The only thing that stood out was the Battlemaster gloves on his hands. Almost all of his equipment and weapons were in it. Next to Soren was Vivian with a pout. The little girl looked unhappy and muttered, "I want to go too. Brother, why don't you let me go with you? If we go together, we might be able to kill those aborigines directly. I'm worried about you going alone." There are so many of them. What if you're discovered? Soren squatted down when he heard this. He reached out and stroked Vivian's little head and said softly, "If I go and you go with me, then there will be no one to guard the camp. If something happens, those pirates will easily collapse. I'll be more relieved if you stay here. Besides, there won't be any danger if I go alone. There are almost no people in this place who can stop me from coming and going freely." Speaking of this, Soren's face showed a confident smile. He had been to many dangerous areas. There were many monsters in the abyss that could see through invisibility and seal the plane, but he still went back and forth. Although his strength was not as strong as before, there were no real gods in the outer islands. At most, there were some legendary monsters that were close to the demigod level. Throughout the thousands of years of the outer islands, no one had heard of a god with weak divine power. Perhaps it was because the Storm Lord was above them, and he would kill any signs of a god with weak divine power. Okay. Vivian nodded gently, but the expression on her cute little face was still a little unhappy. She looked at Soren seriously and said with a serious expression, "Brother, you can go alone, but you have to let me leave a spell mark on you. That way, if you're in danger, I can find a way to teleport to help you." Spell imprint? Soren didn't think too much about it. He nodded and said, "All right." Vivian clapped her hands and stood up. She looked around with her big round eyes, and no one knew what she was thinking. Once Soren agreed, she immediately began to cast her spell. Something was wrong. Soren felt that something was wrong when the little girl started casting her spell. Spell imprint was a very simple low-level arcane spell. With Vivian's strength as a legendary warlock and her powerful talent, it was impossible for her to take such a long time to cast it. Although Soren's spellcraft identify wasn't high enough to determine what spell the little girl was casting, he was sure that it was a very difficult spell. It was probably a level 6 or higher spell. He wanted to interrupt the little girl's spell casting, but he was afraid that it would hurt her. "Vivian. You. What are you doing?" Soren had no choice but to stare at Vivian until she finished chanting the last part of the spell. Only then did he understand what spell she was casting. A terrible pressure shrouded the area. This pressure was stronger than the dragon's aura of an adult dragon, but it wasn't as overbearing. Following the appearance of a spell, a portal opened in front of the two of them. A creature full of power and divine radiance appeared from the portal. It first glanced at Soren, then its eyes fell on the little Vivian. This creature full of divine power and divine radiance stared at the little girl in front of it. It couldn't help but frown slightly and said in a dull voice, "Spellcaster. Are you summoning me? You look like a little girl who hasn't grown up, whether it's your body or your soul. Are you sure you want to make a deal with me?" Jinn. When Soren saw the creature in front of him, he immediately guessed what spell Vivian had just cast. Limited Wish. Level 7 spell. The Jinn in front of him looked a bit like the monster in Aladdin's magic lamp. Its upper body was still in human form, and its skin was pale blue. Its pupils seemed to flash with lightning from time to time, which was the light of divinity. Any Jinn summoned by wish was at the level of a god. The strength level of the one in front of him couldn't be judged, but it was definitely a Jinn above the demigod level. The Jinn of the elemental plane had special rules. They followed the constraints of contracts and laws, and would trade with spellcasters when necessary. This was a Jinn above the demigod level. Now it was its avatar, not the main body of the Jinn. Only some very special transactions could make the main body of the Jinn appear. It was even possible to summon the oldest elemental god. Knowledge, war, the creatures of the wind elemental plane once beat up the abyss demons, and these Jinn were the vanguards. Vivian looked up at Soren, and then said to the Jinn in front of her with a serious face, "At hashtag, yen asterisk hashtag at yen hashtag at hashtag percent at hashtag percent hashtag yen percent at hashtag yen at percent yen at hashtag percent at hashtag percent hashtag." As soon as the little girl spoke, Soren was instantly dumbfounded because she was speaking the demonic language. He had never felt so deeply that learning a foreign language was so important, especially when it came to the demonic language, which was widely used in many planes. The jinn was a neutral creature. The four elemental planes were basically not involved in the battle between the upper and lower planes. Unless there was any idiot who was ready to unify the universe and transform the entire multidimensional plane into one form, the four elemental planes would basically not stand up and do anything. Therefore, the jinn could also trade with the demons. As long as it was any spellcaster who used the wishing spell, they could trade with them. So the jinn also said in the demonic language that Soren could not understand at all, at hashtag percent yen percent, add and asterisk at hashtag add and asterisk percent at hashtag and asterisk, at hashtag yen and asterisk at hashtag yen. This was going to kill him. Soren wanted to interrupt Vivian and let her communicate in the common language, but he was afraid that this would anger the jinn. These jinn were actually not easy to talk to. But before Soren could speak, the jinn seemed to have reached some kind of consensus with Vivian. Then it took out a roll of parchment out of thin air, held a quill pen and began to write quickly. Soon, it filled a contract scroll. It squatted down and handed the contract scroll in its hand to the little Vivian. The little girl looked at it carefully for a while, then pointed out one of the points and argued fiercely with the jinn. It was obvious that the difference in strength between the two sides was huge, but in the face of the little girl's impolite tone of argument, the jinn was not angry at all. Their contract was full of all kinds of traps. Anyone would bargain with them before trading with them. Not much time had passed. Soon, the jinn's face showed a trace of amazement and said seriously, "Very good. According to the contract, I will take a part of your divine power, and then give you some other abilities in return." Little girl. If there is no problem, then sign it. Vivian was very fast. She picked up the quill pen and signed it. Then the jinn's face showed a satisfied smile. It raised its hand and pointed at Vivian. A special contract power emerged and took a part of the little girl's divine power. Then it stretched out its finger and pointed at Vivian and Soren, and a divine light appeared in its eyes. In an instant, as if he had been electrocuted, Soren couldn't help but tremble. Then he felt Vivian beside him. He didn't see her with his eyes, but he felt it with his soul. It was a very wonderful feeling. He could determine Vivian's position and how far away she was from him. As long as he concentrated, he could lock the little girl's specific direction. It was like a very strong telepathy. Chapter 257. Under the dim light of the night. Soren's figure flew out, shuttling through the dense tropical jungle, moving towards the distance at high speed. He was not unfamiliar with such a terrain. When he came to the outer islands to complete a legendary level mission, Soren also fought with the best trackers here. This group of guys had a very powerful tracking ability. They could track the target through footprints, smell, environment, and so on. Even Soren had improved a lot of tracking skills after fighting with them. Pada. Soren's toes tapped lightly on a big tree, and then slowly landed on the ground. There were many messy footprints in front of him. Although a lot of them were covered by weeds, the traces left by high-speed movements were still very obvious. Soren raised his hand and looked for traces of something being dragged away. It was a bit like the traces left by heels. He found a little dark red blood, but there was not much blood. It seemed that the battle was over soon. Soren could already imagine the situation at that time. The pirate scouts he sent out were suddenly attacked, and before they could react, most of them were killed. Then one of them successfully escaped, and the other scouts were dragged away. Looks like they're all masters. Soren's eyes showed a trace of coldness, and his face showed a cruel expression. He slowly said, "Kill these scouts first. They seem to be the elites of the indigenous tribes." Jungle fighting was different from flat ground fighting. The most common thing here was encounter and ambush fighting. Even a grade 4 profession could die in the hands of a low-grade profession that was proficient in tracking and hiding. Because there were too many environments for ambush, and there were many natural traps that could be used. Many brilliant trackers could kill other professions that were 5 levels higher than them here. The most dangerous ability of these indigenous people was tracking and hiding traps, and then there were the use of blow darts and hidden weapons, etc. However, this time, they might not be so lucky, because rogues were also experts in this field. Soren moved quickly along the traces in the grass. His tracking ability was not very good, but it was not enough to lose the traces left today. Brilliant rangers could even track the traces left a few days ago, and even distinguish what kind of enemy left them. Therefore, Soren had always attached great importance to tracking skills. He moved quickly along the grass. He could be sure that the indigenous elites had not returned to the tribe, because they could not know the number of Soren's men if they were not close to the camp. Shadow hiding. After crossing a stream, Soren's figure gradually disappeared into the night. He heard a little movement. It was a scream. It seemed that the pirate scouts sent out during the day were not all killed by them, and 1 or 2 survivors were brought back by them. A trace of killing intent appeared in Soren's eyes. His whole body was shrouded in shadows, and he approached the mountain wall in front of him where some screams came from. There were many places in the outer islands that looked like the Irish coastline. The landscape structure here was completely different from the southern continental shelf. What Soren saw in front of him was a natural cave. It seemed that the enemy was quite familiar with the nearby terrain. No one had come to this cave for a long time. It was a little dark inside, and the cave was not very deep. Soren heard a slight scream again, and saw a faint fire in the cave. It seemed that there was a corner in the cave. He did not recklessly sneak in. Soren reached out and touched the ground, carefully observing the surroundings. His dark vision allowed him to see as clearly at night as during the day. Soon he found a rather clever alarm trap. The indigenous people were very cunning, and their living environment was also very harsh. For someone who could easily kill the pirate scouts sent by Soren, it was impossible for them to be unprepared at night. Soren's trap skills were not enough. He glanced at it and felt that he might not be able to successfully remove the trap without making a sound. Even if he was lucky enough to remove it, it would take too long. Soren reached out and grabbed the edge of the cave. Then, he climbed into the cave along the corner as if he was hanging in the air. He was just 1 or 2 centimeters away from the alarm trap. The people inside the trap would be immediately alerted. The scream continued. There were broken stones in the cave, so Soren had to be careful. He heard the common language and the indigenous language, but he could not hear what was being said clearly because the screams were interrupted. The enemy seemed to be interrogating. Soren did not dare to be careless. His figure slowly approached in the dark. As he turned a corner, the situation in front of him appeared in front of his eyes. He saw 5 indigenous people with oil paint on their bodies. The skin of these indigenous people was darker, but it was not like the black race. Instead, it was like a mixture of the black race and the Native Americans. The bone structure of these guys was thicker, obviously thicker than the bone frame of the mainland people. They were interrogating a pirate scout. The pirate who was being interrogated was badly mutilated. His appearance could not be distinguished at all. His breathing was also very weak. It seemed that he would not last long. There was an indigenous person who looked different next to him. It was obvious that he did not have oil paint on his body. A cold light appeared in Soren's eyes. Because he recognized that this indigenous person was one of the slaves who escaped from him. Because he knew the common language, he was helping to translate the interrogation and telling them the information in the indigenous language. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Soren's eyes were full of killing intent. He quietly approached the enemy who had been asking questions and looked like the leader of the indigenous people. Backstab. Shadow strike. An icy cold light suddenly appeared. Soren's figure emerged from the shadows. The legendary curved sword Icing Death drew a cold light and instantly pierced the heart of the indigenous leader. The tip of the sword penetrated from the back to the chest. The other party's expression was full of shock. Before he could change, he died under Soren's hands. A row of data quickly appeared, shadow strike successful. Shadow Strike launched. Backstab launched. Successfully launched Backstab, causing 116, plus 10, piercing damage to the target. Piercing the target's heart. Triggered the test of death. Target's test of death failed. Target dead. Extracting the target's soul energy. Received 3250 Slaughter EXP, as the Slaughter EXP data emerged. Soren immediately guessed the approximate strength of the opponent in his mind. It should be an enemy above profession level 15, a leader in the indigenous tribe. The enemy seemed to have more than 100 HP, but because his heart was pierced, he did not pass the test of death. Therefore, he could not survive for a period of time like some of the enemies that Soren had encountered in the past. Sword form, spinning strike. After killing the enemy's leader with a sneak attack, Soren did not retreat. On the contrary, he rushed up directly. Another curved sword appeared in his hands out of thin air. He spun it in a circle and slashed at the other two enemies in front of him. Caught off guard. This was the most common reaction under a sneak attack. Many people were caught off guard, and their ability to dodge and parry was greatly reduced. In this case, it was the best time to test one's ability. One of the indigenous people almost subconsciously dodged sideways, then rolled to open the distance, but the other indigenous person was a little slower. He was directly hit in the chest by Soren, and even a large part of his lung was cut open. The former was an indigenous person with a reflex evasion ability, while the latter obviously did not have any powerful evasion ability. Once he encountered a sudden situation, he would inevitably be slower by half a beat. Swoosh! In the face of Soren, who suddenly appeared and killed their leader, the indigenous people reacted quickly. They began to fight back quickly. However, instead of pulling out a weapon, they quickly took out a blow dart. With a few faint cold lights, the blow dart flew out like steel needles. They hit Soren's body, but it did not have the effect it should have. Stone skin. The blow dart did not break through Soren's stone skin. These blow dart with strong anesthetic had no effect at all. Dang! Dang! The blow dart fell to the ground, but Soren jumped out and slashed at the seriously injured enemy. A row of data quickly appeared. Shadow Strike activated. You've dealt 56, plus 10, / damage to the target. You've dealt 26 / damage to the target. Target dead. Extracting target's soul energy, gain 2150 Slaughter EXP. Soren's sword was extremely fast. Almost at the same time as the icing death in his right hand slashed the enemy, the curved sword in his left hand immediately slashed the enemy's abdomen. Soren, who had mastered greater dual wielding, could almost achieve the effect of left and right mutual attack. The curved sword in both hands could fight independently. When he killed the indigenous person in front of him, his left hand almost immediately turned around and directly blocked the attack from the side. Then he bent forward and slashed the enemy's arm with his right hand. Dang! Dang! With a splash of blood, 3 fingers were cut off. Thump! Soren's 2 swords turned into cold lights, and he turned around to cut off half of the hand. At the same time, a distorted shadow appeared beside him, and then 2 heads fell to the ground. Shadow Strike. Summon Shadow. Sword form, beheading. Soren's eyes were cold, and he did not hesitate at all. When the summoned shadow in front of him entangled the enemy, he slashed at the enemy's head. Thump. A headless body fell to the ground. Soren was covered in blood, and there was only one enemy left in front of him. Chapter 258. Facing the last enemy. Soren still didn't hesitate at all. His 2 swords turned into a cold light that shrouded the enemy's vital points. Because he didn't need to keep the enemy alive, and he didn't need to torture anything from the indigenous people in front of him. Since Soren had already planned to explore the enemy's details, there was no need to torture information from the captive. More importantly, the 2 sides didn't speak the same language at all. Plop. Blood splattered out of the wound. Soren stabbed into the abdomen of the skinny aborigine in front of him, then suddenly cut open the abdomen with the tip of the sword, and finally cut off a head with his right hand. Since mastering the sword form, beheading, Soren had become more and more fond of beheading the enemy. As long as the enemy's head was cut off, they would die directly. But if the other parts of the body were cut off, they could still hold on for a while. Of course, this may also be related to the hidden violence in his heart. As a rogue, he actually had the blood of a berserker deep in his heart. A row of data emerged. Soren glanced at it and found that the enemy gave a lot of slaughter EXP. The bottom level of the indigenous people was similar to ordinary people, but the warrior class of the indigenous people was very strong. Their task was to hunt and fight, which was basically a way to gain experience and strength. The ordinary work was basically all on the bottom level of the indigenous people. The 5 enemies were all professions above grade 3. Because there were no spellcasters among them, the slaughter EXP they gave was similar to wilderness monsters of the same grade. A total of 21,500 slaughter EXP was given to Soren. It seemed that they were indeed elites. After killing 20 or so of these enemies, Soren could easily level up his profession by 1 level. Sure enough, sneak attacks are more suitable for me. There were 2 keys to Soren's easy victory. One was that the sneak attack of backstab caught the enemy off guard. In this situation, it was easy to expand the victory in an instant. The other was that he had the support of stone skin, so he didn't have to be afraid of the enemy's blow dart. Because even if Soren had more than 20 points of constitution, he didn't have much confidence to resist the poison on the blow dart. One thing that must be admitted was that these indigenous people had good skills in toxicology. Some were even better than the alchemists on the mainland. There were very few spellcasters among the aborigines. However, he could not rule out the existence of special beings with psionic powers. There were basically no wizards here, only sorcerers and shamans. Shaman priests were a different kind of priest, and their spells were quite different. Since there were no real gods in the outer islands, the spells of the shaman priests were more inclined towards elemental attacks, which were similar to evocation magic attacks. In areas where totem beliefs were distributed, this kind of shaman priest was more common. There were also ancient shaman doctrines that simply worshipped the souls of their ancestors. Surveys had shown that the more civilized a place was and the more widespread the written education, the higher the possibility of spellcasters appearing there. Soren started to collect the loot. The aborigines didn't have anything valuable on them, and Soren wasn't looking for gold, silver, or jewelry. He rummaged through the bodies of the aborigines and soon found 6 blowers and a small bottle of unknown potion. There were steel needles soaked in it. Soren tried to identify the item, and when he saw the attributes, he was so shocked that he broke out in cold sweat. Item type, blow dart, +3, item grade, rare, grade 3, item description. This is a very special blow dart that originated from the Aborigine scouts in the outer islands. In the thousands of years of history of the Aborigines, although it didn't bring them civilization and wisdom, it allowed them to develop some other special skills. This blow dart is smeared with a refined and purified neurotoxin. It will start to take effect in the blink of an eye after hitting the enemy. The dosage of a blow dart can anesthetize an elephant for a short time. There are very few humans who can successfully resist it. Requirements: none. Effect: causes 5 to 10 poison damage to the target, and then after hitting the target, a test of anesthetizing toxin with a difficulty of 20 points will be initiated. Any target that can't pass the test will faint in a short time. Damn! It's actually a grade 3 rare item? Soren immediately broke out in cold sweat when he saw the item's data because he found that the probability of him passing the test was less than 50%. Fortunately, he activated the stone skin spell in advance, or else he might have failed miserably. Soren took a quick look and put away the blow darts, needles, and potions. Then, he leaned over and looked at the captured pirate scout. The pirate was already breathing out more than he was breathing in. The tendons in his hands and feet were all cut off. It was basically impossible to save him. Unless there was a high-grade priest to cast a restoration spell on him, he would be paralyzed even if he was barely saved. The key was that there were no priests in the camp. "I've avenged you." Soren walked over with a blank expression, held his hand and said in a deep voice, "Let me relieve your pain." A cold light appeared. After relieving the pain of the dying pirate, he slowly closed his eyes. There was no other way in this situation. Many times after a battle, there were wounded people who needed others to relieve their pain. After all, the number of priests was only a small number, and it was difficult to popularize expensive divine spells. Otherwise, the disputes in various places would not be at this level. Soren slowly stood up and glanced coldly at the indigenous slave who was killed by him. If this guy didn't escape, the indigenous people probably wouldn't have found them so quickly. Bang! Soren stepped on the indigenous slave's head and then walked out of the cave. Killing these scouts was only the first step. Since Soren had the intention to kill the indigenous people, he naturally had no mercy in his heart. Under the pitch-black night sky, Soren's figure moved forward at high speed in the jungle. The night was his best disguise. At the same time, with the blessing of dark vision, Soren was even more drowsed than drowse. Some night-hunting beasts began to appear, and Soren carefully avoided them. There were some strange fluorescent plants around. If a flying insect approached, it would be swallowed immediately. There were many types of carnivorous plants in the outer islands, so even animals would not easily get close to some places. The sound of a river came from the front. Soren moved forward quickly. This island was not very big, about 50 kilometers in length. It was narrow at both ends and wide in the middle. There was a large primitive jungle inside, and then there was a river flowing from another island. The width of the river was about 50 meters. There was nothing strange on the surface, but it was different after people went down. Soren was not in the mood to care about these piranhas, even if they could provide about 2 slaughter EXP. The signs of human activity in front began to become obvious. Soren even saw abandoned broken fishing nets by the river. The indigenous people's source of food was not all hunting. They also knew how to farm, but the area of land that could be farmed was not much. Soren's figure gradually merged into the darkness. He moved along a muddy road that was obviously often used by people, and soon he saw the cultivated land. There were no crops in the land now, but there were crops like corn and sorghum stacked next to the field. There was the light of torches in the distance, and there was a faint sound of people. Soren first made sure that there were no hidden sentries nearby, and then gradually approached. He was not sure if the indigenous people here had any special means, so he did not get too close. In front of him was a simple village. Looking at the number of houses, the population was about 1,500 people. The indigenous people's population was more densely distributed because they could not survive in the outer islands with a small number of individuals. The periphery was the indigenous people at the bottom. They all lived in low shacks, and the surroundings were very messy. In the center, there was a tall building, and in the distance, there were torches and guards. The indigenous people had a tribal system, similar to the tribal system in Africa where one could marry more than 100 wives to work. The internal hierarchy was strict, and the gap was quite large. Sauron glanced at it for a moment, and then quietly sneaked in. You're tuning into the Dreamy Love Stories YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.